Story 9 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This recording is in the public domain. Story 9, An Egyptian Hornet. The word has an angry, malignant sound that brings the idea of attack vividly into the mind. There is a vicious sting about it somewhere. Even a foreigner, ignorant of the meaning, must feel it. A hornet is wicked. It darts and stabs. It pierces, aiming without provocation for the face and eyes. The name suggests a metallic droning of evil wings, fierce flight, and poisonous assault. Though black and yellow, it sounds scarlet. There is blood in it, a striped tiger of the air in concentrated form. There is no escape if it attacks. In Egypt, an ordinary bee is the size of an English hornet, but the Egyptian hornet is enormous. It is truly monstrous, an ominous, dying terror. It shares that universal quality of the land of the Sphinx and pyramids, great size. It is a formidable insect, worse than scorpion or tarantula. The Reverend James Milligan, meeting one for the first time, realized the meaning of another word as well, a word he used prolifically in his eloquent sermons: devil. One morning in April, when the heat began to bring the insects out, he rose as usual betimes and went across the wide stone corridor to his bath. The desert already glared in through the open windows. The heat would be afflicting later in the day, but at this early hour the cool north wind blew pleasantly down the hotel passages. It was Sunday, and at 8:30 he would appear to conduct the morning service for the English visitors. The floor of the passageway was cold beneath his feet in their thin native slippers of bright yellow. He was neither young nor old. His salary was comfortable. He had a competency of his own, without wife or children to absorb it. The dry climate had been recommended to him, and the big hotel took him in for next to nothing. And he was thoroughly pleased with himself, for he was a sleek, vain, pompous, well-advertised personality, but mean as a rat. No worries of any kind were in his mind, as, carrying sponge and towel, scented soap, and a bottle of Scrubb's ammonia, he travelled amiably across the deserted, shining corridor to the bathroom. And nothing went wrong with the Reverend James Milligan until he opened the door, and his eye fell upon a dark, suspicious-looking object clinging to the window-pane in front of him. And even then, at first, he felt no anxiety or alarm, but merely a natural curiosity to know exactly what it was, this little clot of an odd-shaped, elongated thing that stuck there on the wooden framework 6 feet before his aquiline nose. He went straight up to it to see, then stopped dead. His heart gave a distinct, unclerical leap. His lips formed themselves into unregenerate shape. He gasped, "Good God, what is it?" For something unholy, something wicked as a secret sin, stuck there before his eyes in the patch of blazing sunshine. He caught his breath. For a moment he was unable to move, as though the sight half fascinated him. Then, cautiously and very slowly, stealthily in fact, he withdrew towards the door he had just entered. Fearful of making the smallest sound, he retraced his steps on tiptoe. His yellow slippers shuffled, his dry sponge fell and bounded till it settled, rolling close beneath the horribly attractive object facing him. From the safety of the open door, with ample space for retreat behind him, he paused and stared. His entire being focused itself in his eyes. It was a hornet that he saw. It hung there, motionless and threatening, between him and the bathroom door, and at first he merely exclaimed, below his breath, "Good Lord, it's an Egyptian hornet!" Being a man with a reputation for decided action, however, he soon recovered himself. He was well schooled in self-control. When people left his church at the beginning of the sermon, no muscle of his face betrayed the wounded vanity and annoyance that burned deep in his heart. But a hornet sitting directly in his path was a very different matter. He realized in a flash that he was poorly clothed, in a word, that he was practically half naked. From a distance he examined this intrusion of the devil. It was calm and very still. It was wonderfully made, both before and behind. Its wings were folded upon its terrible body. Long, sinuous things, pointed like temptation, barbed as well, stuck out of it. There was poison, and yet grace, in its exquisite presentment. Its shiny black was beautiful, and the yellow stripes upon its sleek, curved abdomen were like the gleaming ornaments upon some feminine body of the seductive world he preached against. Almost he saw an abandoned dancer on the stage. And then, swiftly, in his impressionable soul, the simile changed, and he saw instead more blunt and aggressive forms of destruction. The well-filled body, tapering to a horrid point, reminded him of those perfect engines of death that reduce hundreds to annihilation unawares, torpedoes, shells, projectiles, crammed with secret, desolating powers. Its wings, its awful quiet head, its delicate slim waist, its stripes of brilliant saffron, all these seemed the concentrated prototype of abominations made cleverly by the brain of man, and beautifully painted to disguise their invisible freight of cruel death. "Bah!" he exclaimed, ashamed of his prolific imagination. "It's only a hornet, after all, an insect." And he contrived a hurried, careful plan. He aimed a towel at it, rolled up into a ball, but did not throw it. He might miss. He remembered that his ankles were unprotected. Instead, he paused again, examining the black and yellow object in safe retirement near the door, as one day he hoped to watch the world in leisurely retirement in the country. It did not move. It was fixed and terrible. It made no sound. Its wings were folded. Not even the black antennae, blunt at the tips like clubs, showed the least stir or tremble. It breathed, however. He watched the rise and fall of the evil body. It breathed air in and out as he himself did. The creature, he realized, had lungs and heart and organs. It had a brain. Its mind was active all this time. It knew it was being watched. It merely waited. Any second, with a whiz of fury, and with perfect accuracy of aim, it might dart at him and strike. If he threw the towel and missed, it certainly would. There were other occupants of the corridor, however, and a sound of steps approaching gave him the decision to act. He would lose his bath if he hesitated much longer. He felt ashamed of his timidity, though pusillanimity was the word thought selected owing to the pulpit vocabulary it was his habit to prefer. He went with extreme caution towards the bathroom door, passing the point of danger so close that his skin turned hot and cold. With one foot gingerly extended, he recovered his sponge. The hornet did not move a muscle. But it had seen him pass. It merely waited. All dangerous insects had that trick. It knew quite well he was inside. It knew quite well he must come out a few minutes later. It also knew quite well that he was naked. Once inside the little room, he closed the door with exceeding gentleness, lest the vibration might stir the fearful insect to attack. The bath was already filled, and he plunged to his neck with a feeling of comparative security. A window into the outside passage he also closed, so that nothing could possibly come in. And steam soon charged the air and left its blurred deposit on the glass. For 10 minutes he could enjoy himself and pretend that he was safe. For 10 minutes he did so. He behaved carelessly, as though nothing mattered, and as though all the courage in the world were his. He splashed and soaped and sponged, making a lot of reckless noise. He got out and dried himself. Slowly the steam subsided, the air grew clearer, he put on dressing-gown and slippers, and it was time to go out. Unable to devise any further reason for delay, he opened the door softly half an inch, peeped out, and instantly closed it again with a resounding bang. He had heard a drone of wings. The insect had left its perch and now buzzed upon the floor directly in his path. The air seemed full of stings. He felt stabs all over him. His unprotected portions winced with the expectancy of pain. The beast knew he was coming out and was waiting for him. In that brief instant he had felt its sting all over him, on his unprotected ankles, on his back, his neck, his cheeks, in his eyes, and on the bald clearing that adorned his Anglican head. Through the closed door he heard the ominous, dull murmur of his striped adversary as it beat its angry wings. Its oiled and wicked sting shot in and out with fury. Its deft legs worked. He saw its tiny waist already writhing with the lust of battle. Ah! That tiny waist! A moment's steady nerve, and he could have severed that cunning body from the directing brain with one swift, well-directed thrust. But his nerve had utterly deserted him. Human motives, even in the professedly holy, are an involved affair at any time. Just now, in the Reverend James Milligan, they were quite inextricably mixed. He claims this explanation, at any rate, in excuse of his abominable subsequent behaviour. For exactly at this moment, when he had decided to admit cowardice by ringing for the Arab servant, a step was audible in the corridor outside, and courage came with it into his disreputable heart. It was the step of the man he cordially disapproved of, using the pulpit version of hated and despised. He had overstayed his time, and the bath was in demand by Mr. Mullins. Mr. Mullins invariably followed him at 7:30. It was now 7:45, and Mr. Mullins was a wretched drinking man, a sot. In a flash the plan was conceived and put into execution. The temptation, of course, was of the devil. Mr. Milligan hid the motive from himself, pretending he hardly recognized it. The plan was what men call a dirty trick. It was also irresistibly seductive. He opened the door, stepped boldly, nose in the air, right over the hideous insect on the floor, and fairly pranced into the outer passage. The brief transit brought 100 horrible sensations: that the hornet would rise and sting his leg, that it would cling to his dressing gown and stab his spine, that he would step upon it and die, like Achilles, of a heel exposed. But with these and conquering them was one other stronger emotion that robbed the lesser terrors of their potency, that Mr. Mullins would run precisely the same risks 5 seconds later, unprepared. He heard the gloating insect buzz and scratch the oilcloth. But it was behind him. He was safe. "Good morning to you, Mr. Mullins," he observed with a gracious smile. "I trust I have not kept you waiting." "Mornin'," grunted Mullins sourly in reply, as he passed him with a distinctly hostile and contemptuous air. For Mullins, though depraved, was perhaps an honest man, abhorring parsons and making no secret of his opinions, whence the bitter feeling. All men, except those very big ones who are supermen, have something astonishingly despicable in them. The despicable thing in Milligan came uppermost now. He fairly chuckled. He met the snub with a calm, forgiving smile, and continued his shambling gait with what dignity he could towards his bedroom opposite. Then he turned his head to see. His enemy would meet an infuriated hornet, an Egyptian hornet, and might not notice it. He might step on it. He might not. But he was bound to disturb it and rouse it to attack. The chances were enormously on the clerical side, and its sting meant death. "May God forgive me," ran subconsciously through his mind, and side by side with the repentant prayer ran also a recognition of the tempter's eternal skill. "I hope the devil it will sting him." It happened very quickly. The Reverend James Milligan lingered a moment by his door to watch. He saw Mullins, the disgusting Mullins, step blithely into the bathroom passage. He saw him pause, shrink back, and raise his arm to protect his face. He heard him swear out loud, "What's the damned thing doing here? Have I really got 'em again?" And then he heard him laugh, a hearty, guffawing laugh of genuine relief. "It's real!" The moment of revulsion was overwhelming. It filled the churchly heart with anguish and bitter disappointment. For a space he hated the whole race of men. For the instant Mr. Mullins realized that the insect was not a fiery illusion of his disordered nerves, he went forward without the smallest hesitation. With his towel he knocked down the flying terror. Then he stooped. He gathered up the venomous thing his well-aimed blow had stricken so easily to the floor. He advanced with it, held at arm's length, to the window. He tossed it out carelessly. The Egyptian hornet flew away uninjured, and Mr. Mullins, the Mr. Mullins who drank, gave nothing to the church, attended no services, hated parsons, and proclaimed the fact with enthusiasm, this same detestable Mr. Mullins went to his unearned bath without a scratch. But first he saw his enemy standing in the doorway across the passage, watching him, and understood. That was the awful part of it. Mullins would make a story of it, and the story would go the round of the hotel. The Reverend James Milligan, however, proved that his reputation for self-control was not undeserved. He conducted morning service half an hour later with an expression of peace upon his handsome face. He conquered all outward sign of inward spiritual vexation. The wicked, he consoled himself, ever flourish like green bay trees. It was notorious that the righteous never have any luck at all. That was bad enough. But what was worse, and the Reverend James Milligan remembered for very long, was the superior ease with which Mullins had relegated both himself and Hornet to the same level of comparative insignificance. Mullins ignored them both, which proved that he felt himself superior. Infinitely worse than the sting of any hornet in the world, he really was superior. End of Story 9. Story 10 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 10, By Water. The night before young Larson left to take up his new appointment in Egypt, he went to the clairvoyant. He neither believed nor disbelieved. He felt no interest, for he already knew his past and did not wish to know his future. "Just to please me, Jim," the girl pleaded. "The woman is wonderful. Before I had been 5 minutes with her, she told me your initials, so there must be something in it." "She read your thought," he smiled indulgently. "Even I can do that." But the girl was in earnest. He yielded, and that night, at his farewell dinner, he came to give his report of the interview. The result was meagre and unconvincing. Money was coming to him, he was soon to make a voyage, and he would never marry. "So you see how silly it all is," he laughed, for they were to be married when his first promotion came. He gave the details, however, making a little story of it in the way he knew she loved. "But was that all, Jim?" the girl asked it, looking rather hard into his face. "Aren't you hiding something from me?" He hesitated a moment, then burst out laughing at her clever discernment. "There was a little more," he confessed, "but you take it all so seriously, He had to tell it then, of course. The woman had told him a lot of gibberish about friendly and unfriendly elements. She said, "Water was unfriendly to me. I was to be careful of water, or else I should come to harm by it. Fresh water only," he hastened to add, seeing that the idea of shipwreck was in her mind. "Drowning?" the girl asked quickly. "Yes," he admitted with reluctance, but still laughing. "She did say drowning, though drowning in no ordinary way." The girl's face showed uneasiness a moment. "What does that mean, drowning in no ordinary way?" she asked, a catch in her breath. But that he could not tell her, because he did not know himself. He gave, therefore, the exact words: "You will drown, but will not know you drown." It was unwise of him. He wished afterwards he had invented a happier report, or had kept this detail back. "I'm safe in Egypt anyhow," he laughed. I shall be a clever man if I can find enough water in the desert to do me harm." And all the way from Trieste to Alexandria he remembered the promise she had extracted, that he would never once go on the Nile unless duty made it imperative for him to do so. He kept that promise, like the literal, faithful soul he was. His love was equal to the somewhat quixotic sacrifice it occasionally involved. Fresh water in Egypt there was practically none other, and in any case the natrum works where his duty lay had their headquarters some distance out into the desert. The river, with its banks of welcome, refreshing verdure, was not even visible. Months passed quickly, and the time for leave came within measurable distance. In the long interval luck had played the cards kindly for him. Vacancies had occurred, early promotion seemed likely, and his letters were full of plans to bring her out to share a little house of their own. His health, however, had not improved. The dryness did not suit him. Even in this short period his blood had thinned, his nervous system deteriorated, and, contrary to the doctor's prophecy, the waterless air had told upon his sleep. A damp climate liked him best, and once the sun had touched him with its fiery finger. His letters made no mention of this. He described the life to her, the work, the sport, the pleasant people, and his chances of increased pay and early marriage. And a week before he sailed, he rode out upon a final act of duty to inspect the latest diggings his company were making. His course lay some 20 miles into the desert behind El Chobak and towards the limestone hills of Gubil Hadi, and he went alone, carrying lunch and tea, for it was the weekly holiday of Friday, and the men were not at work. The accident was ordinary enough. On his way back in the heat of early afternoon, his pony stumbled against a boulder on the treacherous desert film, threw him heavily, broke the girth, bolted before he could seize the reins again, and left him stranded some 10 or 12 miles from home. There was a pain in his knee that made walking difficult, a buzzing in his head that troubled sight and made the landscape swim, while, worse than either, his provisions, fastened to the saddle, had vanished with the frightened pony into those blazing leagues of sand. He was alone in the desert, beneath the pitiless afternoon sun, 12 miles of utterly exhausting country between him and safety. Under normal conditions he would have covered the distance in 4 hours, reaching home by dark, but his knee pained him so that a mile an hour proved the best he could possibly do. He reflected a few minutes. The wisest course was to sit down and wait till the pony told its obvious story to the stable and help should come. And this was what he did, for the scorching heat and glare were dangerous. They were terrible. He was shaken and bewildered by his fall, hungry and weak into the bargain, and an hour's painful scrambling over the baked and burning little gorges must have speedily caused complete prostration. He sat down and rubbed his aching knee. It was quite a little adventure. Yet, though he knew the desert might not be lightly trifled with, he felt at the moment nothing more than this, and the amusing description of it he would give in his letter, or, intoxicating thought, by word of mouth. In the heat of the sun he began to feel drowsy. A soft torpor crept over him. He dozed. He fell asleep. It was a long, dreamless sleep, for when he woke at length the sun had just gone down, the dusk lay awfully upon the enormous desert, and the air was chilly. The cold had waked him. Quickly, as though on purpose, the red glow faded from the sky. The first stars shone. It was dark. The heavens were deep violet. He looked round and realized that his sense of direction had gone entirely. Great hunger was in him. The cold already was bitter as the wind rose, but the pain in his knee having eased, he got up and walked a little, and in a moment lost sight of the spot where he had been lying. The shadowy desert swallowed it. Ah, he realized, this is not an English field or moor. I'm in the desert. The safe thing to do was to remain exactly where he was. Only thus could the rescuers find him. Once he wandered, he was done for. It was strange the search party had not yet arrived. To keep warm, however, he was compelled to move, so he made a little pile of stones to mark the place, and walked round and round it in a circle of some dozen yards diameter. He limped badly, and the hunger gnawed dreadfully, but after all, the adventure was not so terrible. The amusing side of it kept uppermost still. Though fragile in body, his spirit was not unduly timid or imaginative. He could last out the night, or if the worst came to the worst, the next day as well. But when he watched the little group of stones, he saw that there were dozens of them, scores, hundreds, thousands of these little groups of stones. The desert's face, of course, is thickly strewn with them. The original one was lost in the first 5 minutes. So he sat down again. But the biting cold and the wind that licked his very skin beneath the light clothing soon forced him up again. It was ominous, and the night huge and shelterless. The shaft of green zodiacal light that hung so strangely in the western sky for hours had faded away. The stars were out in their bright thousands. No guide was anywhere. The wind moaned and puffed among the sandy mounds. The vast sheet of desert stretched appallingly upon the world. He heard the jackal's cry. And with the jackal's cry came suddenly the unwelcome realization that no play was in this adventure any more, but that a bleak reality stared at him through the surrounding darkness. He faced it at bay. He was genuinely lost. Thought blocked in him. "I must be calm and think," he said aloud. His voice woke no echo. It was small and dead. Something gigantic ate it instantly. He got up and walked again. Why did no one come? Hours had passed. The pony had long ago found its stable, or had it run madly in another direction altogether? He worked out possibilities, tightening his belt. The cold was searching. He never had been, never could be, warm again. The hot sunshine of a few hours ago seemed the merest dream. Unfamiliar with hardship, he knew not what to do, but he took his coat and shirt off, vigorously rubbing his skin where the dried perspiration of the afternoon still caused clammy shivers, swung his arms furiously like a London cabman, and quickly dressed again. Though the wind upon his bare back was fearful, he felt warmer, a little. He lay down exhausted, sheltered by an overhanging limestone crag, and took snatches of fitful dog-sleep, while the wind drove overhead and the dry sand pricked his skin. One face continually was near him, one pair of tender eyes. 2 dear hands smoothed him. He smelt the perfume of light brown hair. It was all natural enough. His whole thought, in his misery, ran to her in England, England where there were soft, fresh grass, big sheltering trees, hemlock and honeysuckle in the hedges, while the hard black desert guarded him, and consciousness dipped away at little intervals under this dry and pitiless Egyptian sky. It was perhaps 5 in the morning when a voice spoke, and he started up with a horrid jerk, the voice of that clairvoyant woman. The sentence died away into the darkness, but one word remained: water. At first he wondered, but at once explanation came. Cause and effect were obvious. The clue was physical. His body needed water, and so the thought came up into his mind. He was thirsty. This was the moment when fear first really touched him. Hunger was manageable, more or less, for a day or two, certainly, but thirst and the desert were an evil pair that, by cumulative suggestion gathering since childhood days, brought terror in. Once in the mind, it could not be dislodged. In spite of his best efforts, the ghastly thing grew passionately, because his thirst grew too. He had smoked much, had eaten spiced things at lunch, had breathed in alkali with the dry, scorched air. He searched for a cool flint pebble to put into his burning mouth, but found only angular scraps of dusty limestone. There were no pebbles here. The cold helped a little to counteract, but already he knew in himself subconsciously the dread of something that was coming. What was it? He tried to hide the thought and bury it out of sight. The utter futility of his tiny strength against the power of the universe appalled him, and then he knew. The merciless sun was on the way, already rising. Its return was like the presage of execution to him. It came. With true horror he watched the marvellous swift dawn break over the sandy sea. The eastern sky glowed hurriedly as from crimsoned fires. Ridges, not noticeable in the starlight, turned black in endless series, like flat-topped billows of a frozen ocean. Wide streaks of blue and yellow followed. As the sky dropped sheets of faint light upon the wind-eaten cliffs and showed their undersides, they did not advance, they waited till the sun was up, and then they moved. They rose and sank, they shifted as the sunshine lifted them, and the shadows crept away. But in an hour there would be no shadows any more. There would be no shade. The little groups of stones began to dance. It was horrible. The unbroken, huge expanse lay round him, warming up 12 hours of blazing hell to come. Already the monstrous desert glared, each bit familiar, since each bit was a repetition of the bit before, behind, on either side. It laughed at guidance and direction. He rose and walked. For miles he walked, though how many, north, south, or west, he knew not. The frantic thing was in him now, the fury of the desert. He took its pace, its endless, tireless stride, the stride of the burning, murderous desert that is waterless. He felt it alive, a blinding, heaving desire in it to reduce him to its conditionless, awful dryness. He felt, yet knowing this was feverish and not to be believed, that his own small life lay on its mighty surface, a mere dot in space, a mere heap of little stones. His emotions, his fears, his hopes, his ambitions, his love, mere bundled group of little unimportant stones that danced with apparent activity for a moment, then were merged in the undifferentiated surface underneath. He was included in a purpose greater than his own. The will made a plucky effort then. A night and a day, he laughed, while his lips cracked smartingly with the stretching of the skin. What is it? Many a chap has lasted days and days. Yes, only he was not of that rare company. He was ordinary, unaccustomed to privation, weak, untrained of spirit, unacquainted with stern resistance. He knew not how to spare himself. The desert struck him where it pleased, all over. It played with him. His tongue was swollen. The parched throat would not swallow. He sank. An hour he lay there, just wit enough in him to choose the top of a mound where he could be most easily seen. He lay 2 hours, 3, 4 hours. The heat blazed down upon him like a furnace. The sky, when he opened his eyes once, was empty. Then a speck became visible in the blue expanse, and presently another speck. They came from nowhere. They hovered very high, almost out of sight. They appeared, they disappeared, they reappeared. Nearer and nearer they swung down in sweeping, stealthy circles, little dancing groups of them, miles away but ever drawing closer, the vultures. He had strained his ears so long for sounds of feet and voices that it seems he could no longer hear at all. Hearing had ceased within him. Then came the water dreams with their agonizing torture. He heard that, heard it running in silvery streams and rivulets across green English meadows. It rippled with silvery music. He heard it splash. He dipped hands and feet and head in it, in deep, clear pools of generous depth. He drank. With his skin he drank not with mouth and throat alone. Ice clinked in effervescent, sparkling water against a glass. He swam and plunged. Water gushed freely over back and shoulders, gallons and gallons of it, bathfuls and to spare, a flood of gushing, crystal, cool, life-giving liquid. And then he stood in a beechwood and felt the streaming deluge of delicious summer rain upon his face, heard it drip luxuriantly upon a million thirsty leaves. The wet trunks shone, the damp moss spread its perfume, ferns waved heavily in the moist atmosphere. He was soaked to the skin in it. A mountain torrent, fresh from fields of snow, foamed boiling past, and the spray fell in a shower upon his cheeks and hair. He dived, head foremost. Ah, he was up to the neck, and she was with him. They were under water together. He saw her eyes gleaming into his own beneath the copious flood. The voice, however, was not hers. You will drown, yet you will not know you drown. His swollen tongue called out a name, but no sound was audible. He closed his eyes. There came sweet unconsciousness. A sound in that instant was audible, though. It was a voice, voices, and the thud of animal hoofs upon the sand. The specks had vanished from the sky as mysteriously as they came. And as though in answer to the sound, he made a movement, an automatic, unconscious movement. He did not know he moved, and the body, uncontrolled, lost its precarious balance. He rolled, but he did not know he rolled. Slowly, over the edge of the sloping mound of sand, he turned sideways. Like a log of wood, he slid gradually, turning over and over, nothing to stop him, to the bottom. A few feet only, and not even steep, just steep enough to keep rolling slowly. There was a splash, but he did not know there was a splash. They found him in a pool of water, one of these rare pools the desert Bedouins mark preciously for their own. He had lain within 3 yards of it for hours. He was drowned, but he did not know he drowned. End of Story 10. Story 11 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 11, H.S.H. In the Mountain Club hut, to which he had escaped after weeks of gaiety in the capital, Delane, young travelling Englishman, sat alone, and listened to the wind that beat the pines with violence. The firelight danced over the bare stone floor and raftered ceiling, giving the room an air of movement, and though the solid walls held steady against the wild spring hurricane, the cannonading of the wind seemed to threaten the foundations. For the mountain shook, the forest roared, and the shadows had a way of running everywhere, as though the little building trembled. Delane watched and listened. He piled the logs on. From time to time he glanced nervously over his shoulder, restless, half uneasy, as a burst of spray from the branches dashed against the window, or a gust of unusual vehemence shook the door. Overwearied with his long day's climb among impossible conditions, he now realized, in this mountain refuge, his utter loneliness, for his mind gave birth to that unwelcome symptom of true loneliness, that he was not, after all, alone. Continually he heard steps and voices in the storm. Another wanderer, another climber out of season like himself, would presently arrive, and sleep was out of the question until first he heard that knocking on the door. Almost he expected someone. He went for the 10th time to the little window. He peered forth into the thick darkness of the dropping night, shading his eyes against the streaming pane to screen the firelight in an attempt to see if another climber, perhaps a climber in distress, were visible. The surroundings were desolate and savage, well named the Devil's Saddle. Black-faced precipices, streaked with melting snow, rose towering to the north, where the heights were hidden in seas of vapour. Waterfalls poured into abysses on two sides. A wall of impenetrable forest pressed up from the south, and the dangerous ridge he had climbed all day slid off wickedly into a sky of surging cloud. But no human figure was, of course, distinguishable, for both the lateness of the hour and the elemental fury of the night rendered it most unlikely. He turned away with a start as the tempest delivered a blow with massive impact against his very face. Then, clearing the remnants of his frugal supper from the table, he hung his soaking clothes at a new angle before the fire, made sure the door was fastened on the inside, climbed into the bunk where white pillows and thick Austrian blankets looked so inviting, and prepared finally for sleep. "I must be overtired," he sighed, after half an hour's weary tossing, and went back to make up the sinking fire. Wood is plentiful in these climbers' huts. He heaped it on. But this time he lit the little oil lamp as well, realizing, though unwilling to acknowledge it, that it was not over-fatigue that banished sleep, but this unwelcome sense of expecting someone, of being not quite alone. For the feeling persisted and increased. He drew the wooden bench close up to the fire, turned the lamp as high as it would go, and wished unaccountably for the morning. Light was a very pleasant thing, and darkness now, for the first time since childhood, troubled him. It was outside, but it might so easily come in and swamp, obliterate, extinguish. The darkness seemed a positive thing. Already, somehow, it was established in his mind, this sense of enormous, aggressive darkness that veiled an undesirable hint of personality. Some shadow from the peaks or from the forest, immense and threatening, pervaded all his thought. "This can't be entirely nerves," he whispered to himself. "I'm not so tired as all that." And he made the fire roar. He shivered and drew closer to the blaze. "I'm out of condition, that's part of it," he realized, and remembered with loathing the weeks of luxurious indulgence just behind him. For Delane had rather wasted his year of educational travel. Straight from Oxford, and well supplied with money, he had first saturated his mind in the latest continental thought, the science of France, the metaphysics and philosophy of Germany, and had been caught aside by the gaiety of capitals where the lights were not turned out at midnight by a Sunday school police. He had been surfeited, physically, emotionally, and intellectually, till his mind and body longed hungrily for simple living again, and simple teaching, above all, the latter. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, for certain temperaments, as Blake forgot to add, of which Delane was one. For there was stuff in the youth, and the reaction had set in with violent abruptness. His system rebelled. He cut loose energetically from all soft delights, and craved for severity, pure air, solitude, and hardship. Clean and simple conditions he must have without delay, and the tonic of physical battling. It was too early in the year to climb seriously, for the snow was still dangerous and the weather wild, but he had chosen this most isolated of all the mountain huts in order to make sure of solitude, and had come, without guide or companion, for a week's strenuous life in wild surroundings, and to take stock of himself, with a view to full recovery. And all day long, as he climbed the desolate, unsafe ridge, his mind, good, wholesome, natural symptom, had reverted to his childhood days, to the solid, worldly wisdom of his church-going father, and to the early teaching, oh, how sweet and refreshing in its literal spirit, at his mother's knee. Now, as he watched the blazing logs, it came back to him again with redoubled force. the simple, precious, old-world stories of heaven and hell, of a paternal deity, and of a daring, subtle, personal devil. The interruption to his thoughts came with startling suddenness as the roaring night descended against the windows with a thundering violence that shook the walls and sucked the flame half-way up the wide stone chimney. The oil lamp flickered and went out. Darkness invaded the room for a second, and Delane sprang from his bench, thinking the wet snow had loosened far above and was about to sweep the hut into the depths. And he was still standing, trembling and uncertain, in the middle of the room, when a deep and sighing hush followed sharp upon the elemental outburst, and in the hush, like a whisper after thunder, he heard a curious, steady sound that at first he thought must be a footstep by the door. It was then instantly repeated, but it was not a step. It was someone knocking on the heavy oaken panels, a firm, authoritative sound, as though the new arrival had the right to enter and was already impatient at the delay. The Englishman recovered himself instantly, realizing with keen relief the new arrival. At last. Another climber like himself, of course, he said, or perhaps the man who comes to prepare the hut for others. The season has begun. And he went over quickly, without a further qualm, to unbolt the door. "Forgive," he exclaimed in German as he threw it wide. "I was half asleep before the fire. It is a terrible night. Come in to food and shelter, for both are here, and you shall share such supper as I possess." And a tall, cloaked figure passed him swiftly, with a gust of angry wind from the impenetrable blackness of the world beyond. On the threshold, for a second, his outline stood full in the blaze of firelight, with the sheet of darkness behind it, stately, erect, commanding, his cloak torn fiercely by the wind, but the face hidden by a low-brimmed hat, and an instant later the door shut with resounding clamour upon the hurricane, and the two men turned to confront one another in the little room. Delane then realized two things sharply, both of them fleeting impressions, but acutely vivid. First, that the outside darkness seemed to have entered and established itself between him and the new arrival. And secondly, that the stranger's face was difficult to focus for clear sight, although the covering hat was now removed. There was a blur upon it somewhere. And this the Englishman ascribed partly to the flickering effect of firelight, and partly to the lightning glare of the man's masterful and terrific eyes, which made his own sight waver in some curious fashion as he gazed upon him. These impressions, however, were but momentary and passing, due doubtless to the condition of his nerves and to the semi-shock of the dramatic, even theatrical entrance. Delane's senses in this wild setting were guilty of exaggeration. For now, while helping the man remove his cloak, speaking naturally of shelter, food, and the savage weather, he lost his first distortion, and his mind recovered sane proportion. The stranger, after all, though striking, was not of appearance so uncommon as to cause alarm. The light and the low doorway had touched his stature with illusion. He dwindled, and the great eyes, upon calmer subsequent inspection, lost their original fierce lightning. The entering darkness, moreover, was but an effect of the upheaving night behind him as he strode across the threshold. The closed door proved it. And yet, as Delane continued his quieter examination, there remained, he saw, the startling quality which had caused that first magnifying in his mind. His senses, while reporting accurately, insisted upon this arresting and uncommon touch. There was, about this late wanderer of the night, some evasive, lofty strangeness that set him utterly apart from ordinary men. The Englishman examined him searchingly, surreptitiously, but with a touch of passionate curiosity he could not in the least account for nor explain. There were contradictions of perplexing character about him. For the first presentment had been of splendid youth, while on the face, though vigorous and gloriously handsome, he now discerned the stamp of tremendous age. It was worn and tired. While radiant with strength and health and power, it wore as well this certain signature of deep exhaustion that great experience rather than physical experience brings. Moreover, he discovered in it, in some way he could not hope to describe, man, woman, and child. There was a big, sad earnestness about it, yet a touch of humour too. Patience, tenderness, and sweetness held the mouth, and behind the high, pale forehead intellect sat enthroned and watchful. In it were both love and hatred, longing and despair. An expression of being ever on the defensive, yet hugely mutinous, an air both hunted and beseeching, great knowledge and great woe. Delane gave up the search, aware that something unalterably splendid stood before him. Solemnity and beauty swept him too. His was never the grotesque assumption that man must be the highest being in the universe, nor that a thing is a miracle merely because it has never happened before. He groped while explanation and analysis both halted. A great teacher, thought fluttered through him, or a mighty rebel, a distinguished personality beyond all question. Who can he be? There was something regal that put respect upon his imagination instantly, and he remembered the legend of the countryside that Ludwig of Bavaria was said to be about when nights were very wild. He wondered. Into his speech and manner crept unawares an attitude of deference that was almost reverence, and with it, whence came this other quality? A searching pity. "You must be wearied out," he said respectfully, busying himself about the room, "as well as cold and wet. This fire will dry you, sir, and meanwhile I will prepare quickly such food as there is if you will eat it." For the other carried no knapsack, nor was he clothed for the severity of mountain travel. "I have already eaten," said the stranger courteously, "and with my thanks to you, I am neither wet nor tired. The afflictions that I bear are of another kind, though ones that you shall more easily, I am sure, relieve." He spoke as a man whose words set troops in action, and Delane glanced at him, deeply moved by the surprising phrase, yet hardly marvelling that it should be so. He found no ready answer, but there was evidently question in his look, for the other continued, and this time with a smile that betrayed sheer winning beauty as of a tender woman, "I saw the light and came to it. It is unusual at this time." His voice was resonant, but not deep. There was a ringing quality about it that the bare room emphasized. It charmed the young Englishman inexplicably. Also, it woke in him a sense of infinite pathos. "You are a climber, sir, like myself," Delane resumed, lifting his eyes a moment uneasily from the coffee he brewed over a corner of the fire. "You know this neighbourhood, perhaps? Better, at any rate, than I can know it." His German halted rather. He chose his words with difficulty. There was uncommon trouble in his mind. "I know all wild and desolate places," replied the other, in perfect English, but with a wintry mournfulness in his voice and eyes, "for I feel at home in them, and their stern companionship my nature craves as solace. But, unlike yourself, I am no climber." "The heights have no attraction for you?" asked Delane, as he mingled steaming milk and coffee in the wooden bowl, marvelling what brought him then so high above the valleys. "It is their difficulty and danger that fascinate me always. I find the loneliness of the summits intoxicating in a sense." And, regardless of refusal, he set the bread and meat before him, the apple and the tiny packet of salt, then turned away to place the coffee-pot beside the fire again. But as he did so, a singular gesture of the other caught his eyes. Before touching bowl or plate, the stranger took the fruit and brushed his lips with it. He kissed it, then set it on the ground and crushed it into pulp beneath his heel. And seeing this, the young Englishman knew something dreadfully arrested in his mind, for, as he looked away, pretending the act was unobserved, a thing of ice and darkness moved past him through the room, so that the pot trembled in his hand, rattling sharply against the hearthstone where he stooped. He could only interpret it as an act of madness, and the myth of the sad, drowned monarch wandering through this enchanted region pressed into him, again unsought and urgent. It was a full minute before he had control of his heart and hand again. The bowl was half emptied, and the man was smiling, this time the smile of a child who implores the comfort of enveloping and understanding arms. "I am a wanderer rather than a climber," he was saying, as though there had been no interval. "For though the lonely summits suit me well, I now find in them only terror. My feet lose their sureness, and my head its steady balance. I prefer the hidden gorges of these mountains, and the shadows of the covering forests. My days," his voice drew the loneliness of uttermost space into its piteous accents, "are passed in darkness. I can never climb again." He spoke this time, indeed, as a man whose nerve was gone forever. It was pitiable, almost to tears; and Delane, unable to explain the amazing contradictions, felt recklessly, furiously drawn to this trapped wanderer, with the mien of a king, yet the air and speech sometimes of a woman, and sometimes of an outcast child. "Ah, then, you have known accidents," Delane replied, with outer calmness, as he lit his pipe, trying in vain to keep his hand as steady as his voice. "You have been in one, perhaps. The effect, I have been told, is—" The power and sweetness in that resonant voice took his breath away as he heard it break in upon his own uncertain accents. "I have fallen," the stranger replied impressively, as the rain and wind wailed past the building mournfully, "yet a fall that was no part of any accident, for it was no common fall," the man added with a magnificent gesture of disdain, "while yet it broke my heart in two." He stooped a little as he uttered the next words with a crying pathos that an outcast woman might have used. "I am," he said, "engulfed in intolerable loneliness. I can never climb again." With a shiver impossible to control, half of terror, half of pity, Delane moved a step nearer to the marvellous stranger. The spirit of Ludwig, exiled and distraught, had gripped his soul with a weakening terror. But now sheer beauty lifted him above all personal shrinking. There seemed some echo of lost divinity, worn, wild, yet grandiose, through which this significant language strained towards a personal message for himself. "In loneliness?" he faltered, sympathy rising in a flood. "For my kingdom that is lost to me forever," met him in deep throbbing tones that set the air on fire. "For my imperial ancient heights that jealousy took from me." The stranger paused, with an indescribable air of broken dignity and pain. Outside, the tempest paused a moment before the awful elemental crash that followed. A bellowing of many winds descended like artillery upon the world. A burst of smoke rushed from the fireplace upon them both, shrouding the stranger momentarily in a flying veil. And Delane stood up, uncomfortable in his very bones. "What can it be?" he asked himself sharply. "Who is this being that he should use such language?" He watched alarm chase pity, aware that the conversation held something beyond experience. But the pity returned in greater and greater flood, and love surged through him too. It was significant, he remembered afterwards, that he felt it incumbent upon himself to stand. Curious, too, how the thought of that mad, drowned monarch haunted memory with such persistence. Some vast emotion that he could not name drove out his subsequent words. The smoke had cleared, and a strange, high stillness held the world. The rain streamed down in torrents, isolating these two somehow from the haunts of men, And the Englishman stared then into a countenance grown mighty with woe and loneliness. There stood darkly in it this incommunicable magnificence of pain that mingled awe with the pity he had felt. The kingly eyes looked clear into his own, completing his subjugation out of time. "I would follow you," ran his thought upon its knees, "follow you with obedience for ever and ever, even into a last damnation, for you are sublime. You shall come again into your kingdom if my own small worship—" Then blackness sponged the reckless thought away. He spoke in its place a more guarded, careful thing. "I am aware," he faltered, yet conscious that he bowed, "of standing before a great one of some world unknown to me. Who he may be I have but the privilege of wondering. He has spoken darkly of a kingdom that is lost, yet he is still, I see, a monarch." And he lowered his head and shoulders involuntarily. For an instant, then, as he said it, the eyes before him flashed their original terrific lightnings. The darkness of the common world faded before the entrance of an outer darkness. From gulfs of terror at his feet rose shadows out of the night of time, and a passionate anguish as of sudden madness seized his heart and shook it. He listened breathlessly for the words that followed. It seemed some wind of unutterable despair passed in the breath from those non-human lips. "I am still a monarch, yes, but my kingdom is taken from me, for I have no single subject. Lost in a loneliness that lies out of space and time, I am become a throneless ruler, and my hopelessness is more than I can bear." The beseeching pathos of the voice tore him in two. The deity himself, it seemed, stood there, accused of jealousy, of sin and cruelty. The stranger rose. The power about him brought the picture of a planet throned in mid-heaven and poised beyond assault. "Not otherwise," boomed the startling words as though an avalanche found syllables, "could I now show myself to you." Delane was trembling horribly. He felt the next word slip off his tongue unconsciously. The shattering truth had dawned upon his soul at last. "Then the light you saw and came to," he whispered. "Was the light in your heart that guided me," came the answer, sweet, beguiling as the music in a woman's tones, "the light of your instant, brief desire that held love in it." He made an opening movement with his arms as he continued, smiling like stars in summer. "For you summoned me by your dear and precious belief. How dear, how precious, none can know but I who stand before you." His figure drew up with an imperial air of proud dominion. His feet were set among the constellations. The opening movement of his arms continued slowly, and the music in his tones seemed merged in distant thunder. "For your single brief belief," he smiled with the grandeur of a condescending emperor, "shall give my vanished kingdom back to me." And with an air of native majesty he held his hand out to be kissed. The black hurricane of night, the terror of frozen peaks, the yawning horror of the great abyss outside, all three crowded into the Englishman's mind with a slashing impact that blocked delivery of any word or action. It was not that he refused, it was not that he withdrew, but that life stood paralyzed and rigid. The flow stopped dead for the first time since he had left his mother's womb. The God in him was turned to stone and rendered ineffective. For an appalling instant, God was not. He realized the stupendous moment. Before him, drinking his little soul out merely by his presence, stood one whose habit of mind, not alone his external accidents, was imperial with black prerogative before the first man drew the breath of life. August procedure was native to his inner process of existence. The stars and confines of the universe owned his sway before he fell, to trifle away the dreary little centuries by haunting the minds of feeble men and women, by hiding himself in nursery cupboards, and by grinning with stained gargoyles from the roofs of city churches. And the lad's life stammered, flickered, threatened to go out before the enveloping terror of the revelation. "I call to you, but call to you in play," thought whispered somewhere, deep below the level of any speech, yet not so low that the audacious sound of it did not crash above the elements outside. "For till now you have been to me but a coated bogey, that my brain disowned with laughter, and my heart thought picturesque. If you are here, alive, may God forgive me for my—" It seemed as though tears, the tears of love and profound commiseration, drowned the very seed of thought itself. A sound stopped him that was like a collapse in heaven. Some crashing as of a ruined world passed splintering through his little timid heart. He did not yield, but he understood, with an understanding which seemed the delicate first sign of yielding, the seductiveness of evil, the sweet delight of surrendering the will with utter recklessness to those swelling forces which disintegrate the heroic soul in man. He remembered. It was true. In the reaction from excess he had definitely called upon his childhood's teaching with a passing moment of genuine belief. And now that yearning of a fraction of a second bore its awful fruit. The luscious capitals where he had rioted passed in a coloured stream before his eyes. The wine, the woman, and the song stood there before him, clothed in that power which lies insinuatingly disguised behind their little passing show of innocence. Their glamour donned this domino of regal and virile grandeur. He felt entangled beyond recovery. The idea of God seemed sterile and without reality. The one real thing, the one desirable thing, the one possible strong and beautiful thing, was to bend his head and kiss those imperial fingers. He moved noiselessly towards the hand. He raised his own to take it and lift it towards his mouth. When there arose in his mind with startling vividness a small, soft picture of a child's nursery, a picture of a little boy, kneeling in scanty nightgown, with pink upturned soles, and asking ridiculous, audacious things of a shining figure seated on a summer cloud above the kitchen garden walnut tree. The tiny symbol flashed and went its way, yet not before it had lit the entire world with glory. For there came an absolutely routing power with it. In that half-forgotten instant's craving for the simple teaching of his childhood days, belief had conjured with two immense traditions. This was the second of them. The appearance of the one had inevitably produced the passage of its opposite. And the hand that floated in the air before him to be kissed sank slowly down below the possible level of his lips. He shrank away. Though laughter tempted something in his brain, there still clung about his heart the first aching, pitying terror. But sighs retreated, dwindling somehow as it went. The wind and rain obliterated every other sound. Yet in that bare, unfurnished room of a climber's mountain hut there was a silence above the roar that drank in everything and broke the back of speech. In opposition to this masquerading splendour, Delane had set up a personal, paternal deity. "I thought of you, perhaps," cried the voice of self-defence, "but I did not call to you with real belief. And by the name of God I did not summon you, for your sweetness, as your power, sickens me, and your hand is black with the curses of all the mothers of the world, whose prayers and tears—" He stopped dead, overwhelmed by the cruelty of his reckless utterance. And the other moved towards him slowly. It was like the summit of some peaked and terrible height that moved. He spoke. He changed appallingly. "But I claim," he roared, "your heart. I claim you by that instant of belief you felt. For by that alone you shall restore to me my vanished kingdom. You shall worship me." In the countenance was a sudden, awful power, but behind the stupefying roar there was weakness in the voice as of an imploring and beseeching child. Again deep love and searching pity seared the Englishman's heart as he replied, in the gentlest accents he could find to master. "And I claim you," he said, "by my understanding sympathy, and by my sorrow for your God-forsaken loneliness, and by my love, for no kingdom built on hate can stand against the love you would deny." Words failed him then, as he saw the majesty fade slowly from the face, grown smaller and shadowy. One last expression of desperate energy in the eyes struck lightnings from the smoky air, as with an abandoned movement of the entire figure he drew back, it seemed, towards the door behind him. Delane moved slowly after him, opening his arms. Tenderness and big compassion flung wide the gates of love within him. He found strange language, too, although actual spoken words did not produce them further than his entrails where they had their birth. "Toys in the world are plentiful, sire, and you may have them for your masterpiece of play. But you must seek them where they still survive. In the churches and in isolated lands where thought lies unawakened. For they are the children's blocks of make-believe, whose palaces, like your once tremendous kingdom, have no true existence for the thinking mind." And he stretched his hands toward him with the gesture of one who sought to help and save, then paused as he realized that his arms enclosed sheer blackness, with the emptiness of wind and driving rain. For the door of the hut stood open, and Delane balanced on the threshold, facing the sheet of night above the abyss. He heard the waterfalls in the valley far below. The forest flapped and tossed its myriad branches. Cold draughts swept down from spectral fields of melting snow above, and the blackness turned momentarily into the semblance of towers and bastions of thick beaten gloom. Above one soaring turret, then, a space of sky appeared, swept naked by a violent lost wind, an opening of purple into limitless distance. For 1 second, amid the vapours, it was visible, empty and untenanted. The next, there sailed across its small diameter a falling star. With an air of slow and endless leisure, yet at the same time with terrific speed, it dived behind the ragged curtain of the clouds, and the space closed up again. Blackness returned upon the heavens. And through this blackness, plunging into that abyss of woe whence he had momentarily risen, the figure of the marvellous stranger melted utterly away. Delane, for a fleeting second, was aware of the earnestness in the sad, imploring countenance, of its sweetness and its power so strangely mingled, of its mysterious grandeur and of its pathetic childishness. But already it was sunk into interminable distance. A star that would be baleful, yet was merely glorious, passed on its endless wandering among the teeming systems of the universe. Behind the fixed and steady stars, secure in their appointed places, it set. It vanished into the pit of unknown emptiness. It was gone. "God help you," sighed across the sea of wailing branches, echoing down the dark abyss below. "God give you rest at last." For he saw a princely, nay, an imperial being, homeless forever, and forever wandering, hunted as by keen, remorseless winds about a universe that held no corner for his feet, his majesty unworshipped, his reign a mockery, his court unfurnished, and his courtiers mere shadows of deep space. And a thin grey dawn, stealing up behind clearing summits in the east, crept then against the windows of the mountain hut. It brought with it a treacherous, sharp air that made the sleeper draw another blanket near to shelter him from the sudden cold, for the fire had died out, and an icy draught sucked steadily beneath the doorway. End of Story 11. Story 12 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 12, A Bit of Wood. He found himself in Meran with some cousins who had various slight ailments, but being rich and imaginative, had gone to a sanatorium to be cured. But for its sanatoria, Meran might be a cheerful place. Their ubiquity reminds a healthy man too often that the air is really good. Being well enough himself, except for a few mental worries, he went to a Gasthaus in the neighborhood. In the sanatorium his cousins complained bitterly of the food, the ignorant sisters, the inattentive doctors, and the idiotic regulations generally, which proves that people should not go to a sanatorium unless they are really ill. However, they paid heavily for being there, so felt that something was being accomplished, and were annoyed when he called each day for tea, and told them cheerfully how much better they looked, which proved again that their ailments were slight and quite curable by the local doctor at home. With one of the ailing cousins, a rich and pretty girl, he believed himself in love. It was a 3 weeks' business, and he spent his mornings walking in the surrounding hills, his mind reflective, analytical, and ambitious, as with a man in love. He thought of thousands of things. He mooned. Once, for instance, he paused beside a rivulet to watch the buttercups dip, and asked himself, "Will she be like this when we're married, so anxious to be well that she thinks fearfully all the time of getting ill?" For if so, he felt he would be bored. He knew himself accurately enough to realize that he never could stand that. Yet money was a wonderful thing to have, and he, already 35, had little enough. "Am I influenced by her money, then?" he asked himself, and so went on to ask and wonder about many things besides. For he was of a reflective temperament, and his father had been a minor poet. And doubt crept in. He felt a chill. He was not much of a man, perhaps, thin-blooded and unsuccessful, rather a dreamer, too, into the bargain. He had £100 a year of his own, and a position in a philanthropic institution, due to influence, with a nominal salary attached. He meant to keep the latter after marriage. He would work just the same. Nobody would ever say that of him. And as he sat on the fallen tree beside the rivulet, idly knocking stones into the rushing water with his stick, he reflected upon those banal truisms that epitomize 2/3 of life. The way little unimportant things can change a person's whole existence was the one his thought just now had fastened on. His cousin's chill and headache, for instance, caught at a gloomy picnic on the Campagna 3 weeks before, had led to her going into a sanatorium, and being advised that her heart was weak, that she had a tendency to asthma, that gout was in her system, and that a treatment of X-rays, radium, sun baths, and light baths, violet rays, no meat, complete rest, with big daily fees to experts with European reputations, were imperative. From the chill sitting a moment too long in the shadow of a forgotten patrician tomb, he reflected, has come all this, including his doubts as to whether it was herself or her money that he loved, whether he could stand living with her always, whether he need really keep his work on after marriage, in a word, his entire life and future, and her own as well, all from that tiny chill 3 weeks ago. And he knocked with his stick a little piece of sawn-off board that lay beside the rushing water. Upon that bit of wood his mind, his mood, then fastened itself. It was triangular, a piece of sawn-off wood, brown with age and ragged. Once it had been part of a triumphant, hopeful sapling on the mountains. Then, when 30 years of age, the men had cut it down. The rest of it stood somewhere now, at this very moment, in the walls of a house. This extra bit was cast away as useless. It served no purpose anywhere. It was slowly rotting in the sun. But each tap of the stick, he noticed, turned it sideways without sending it over the edge into the rushing water. It was obstinate. "It doesn't want to go in," he laughed, his father's little talent cropping up in him. "But, by Jove, it shall." And he pushed it with his foot. But again it stopped, stuck endways against a stone. He then stooped, picked it up, and threw it in. It plopped and splashed and went scurrying away downhill with the bubbling water. Even that scrap of useless wood, he reflected, rising to continue his aimless walk, and still idly dreaming, even that bit of rubbish may have a purpose, and may change the life of someone, somewhere. And then went strolling through the fragrant pine woods, crossing a dozen similar streams, and hitting scores of stones and scraps and fir cones as he went, till he finally reached his Gasthaus an hour later, and found a note from her. "We shall expect you about 3 o'clock. We thought of going for a drive. The others feel so much better." It was a revealing touch, the way she put it on "the others." He made his mind up then and there. Thus tiny things divide the course of life, that he could never be happy with such an affected creature. He went for that drive, sat next to her consuming beauty, proposed to her passionately on the way back, was accepted before he could change his mind, and is now the father of several healthy children, and just as much afraid of getting ill or of their getting ill as she was 15 years before. The female, of course, matures long, long before the male, he reflected, thinking the matter over in his study once. And that scrap of wood he idly set in motion out of impulse also went its destined way upon the hurrying water that never dared to stop. Proud of its new-found motion, it bobbed down merrily, spinning and turning for a mile or so, dancing gaily over sunny meadows, brushing the dipping buttercups as it passed, through vineyards, woods, and under dusty roads in neat, cool gutters, and tumbling headlong over little waterfalls until it neared the plain. And so finally it came to a wooden trough that led off some of the precious water to a sawmill where bare-armed men did practical and necessary things. At the parting of the ways, its angles delayed it for a moment, undecided which way to take. It wobbled, and upon that moment's wobbling hung tragic issues, issues of life and death. Unknowing, yet assuredly not unknown, it chose the trough. It swung light-heartedly into the tearing sluice. It whirled with the gush of water towards the wheel, banged, spun, trembled, caught fast in the side where the cogs just chanced to be, and abruptly stopped the wheel. At any other spot the pressure of the water must have smashed it into pulp, and the wheel have continued as before, but it was caught in the one place where the various tensions held it fast immovably. It stopped the wheel, and so the machinery of the entire mill. It jammed like iron. The particular angle at which the double-handed saw, held by 2 weary and perspiring men, had cut it off a year before, just enabled it to fit and wedge itself with irresistible exactitude. The pressure of the tearing water combined with the weight of the massive wheel to fix it tight and rigid. And in due course a workman, it was the foreman of the mill, came from his post inside to make investigations. He discovered the irritating item that caused the trouble. He put his weight in a certain way, he strained his hefty muscles, he swore, and the scrap of wood was easily dislodged. He fished the morsel out and tossed it on the bank, and spat on it. The great wheel started with a mighty groan, but it started a fraction of a second before he expected it would start. He overbalanced, clutching the revolving framework with a frantic effort, shouted, swore, leaped at nothing, and fell into the pouring flood. In an instant he was turned upside down, sucked under, drowned. He was engaged to be married, and had put by 1,000 kronen in the Tiroler Sparbank. He was a sober and hard-working man. There was a paragraph in the local paper 2 days later. The Englishman, asking the porter of his Gasthaus for something to wrap up a present he was taking to his cousin in the sanatorium, used that very issue. As he folded its crumpled and recalcitrant sheets with sentimental care upon the precious object, his eye fell carelessly upon the paragraph. Being of an idle and reflective temperament, he stopped to read it. It was headed Unglücksfall, and his poetic eye, inherited from his foolish rhyming father, caught the pretty expression fließendes Wasser. He read the first few lines. Some fellow with a picturesque Tyrolese name had been drowned beneath a mill-wheel. He was popular in the neighbourhood, it seemed. He had saved some money, and was just going to be married. It was very sad. Our reader's sympathy was with him, and being of a reflective temperament, the Englishman thought for a moment while he went on wrapping up the parcel. He wondered if the man had really loved the girl, whether she too had money, and whether they would have had lots of children and been happy ever afterwards. And then he hurried out towards the sanatorium. I shall be late, he reflected. Such little unimportant things delay one. End of Story 12. Story 13 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 13, A Victim of Higher Space. "There's a extraordinary gentleman to see you, sir," said the new man. "Why extraordinary?" asked Dr. Silence, drawing the tips of his thin fingers through his brown beard. His eyes twinkled pleasantly. "Why extraordinary, Barker?" he repeated encouragingly, noticing the perplexed expression in the man's eyes. "He's so thin, sir. I could hardly see him at all, at first. He was inside the house before I could ask the name," he added, remembering strict orders. "And who brought him here?" "He came alone, sir, in a closed cab. He pushed by me before I could say a word, making no noise, not what I could hear. He seemed to move so soft-like." The man stopped short with obvious embarrassment, as though he had already said enough to jeopardize his new situation, but trying hard to show that he remembered the instructions and warnings he had received with regard to the admission of strangers not properly accredited. "And where is the gentleman now?" asked Dr. Silence, turning away to conceal his amusement. "I really couldn't exactly say, sir. I left him standing in the hall." The doctor looked up sharply. "But why in the hall, Barker? Why not in the waiting room?" He fixed his piercing, though kindly eyes on the man's face. "Did he frighten you?" he asked quickly. "I think he did, sir, if I may say so. I seemed to lose sight of him, as it were." The man stammered, evidently convinced by now that he had earned his dismissal. "He come in so funny-like, just like a cold wind," he added boldly, setting his heels at attention and looking his master full in the face. The doctor made an internal note of the man's halting description. He was pleased that the slight signs of psychic intuition which had induced him to engage Barker had not entirely failed at the first trial. Dr. Silence sought for this qualification in all his assistants, from secretary to serving man, and if it surrounded him with a somewhat singular crew, the drawbacks were more than compensated for, on the whole, by their occasional flashes of insight. "So the gentleman made you feel queer, did he?" "That was it, I think, sir," repeated the man stolidly. "And he brings no kind of introduction to me, no letter or anything?" asked the doctor, with feigned surprise, as though he knew what was coming. The man fumbled, both in mind and pockets, and finally produced an envelope. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, greatly flustered. "The gentleman handed me this for you." It was a note from a discerning friend, who had never yet sent him a case that was not vitally interesting from one point or another. "Please see the bearer of this note," the brief message ran, "though I doubt if even you can do much to help him." John Silence paused a moment, so as to gather from the mind of the writer all that lay behind the brief words of the letter. Then he looked up at his servant with a graver expression than he had yet worn. "Go back and find this gentleman," he said, "and show him into the green study. Do not reply to his question or speak more than actually necessary, but think kind, helpful, sympathetic thoughts as strongly as you can, Barker. You remember what I told you about the importance of thinking when I engaged you. Put curiosity out of your mind, and think gently, sympathetically, affectionately, if you can." He smiled, and Barker, who had recovered his composure in the doctor's presence, bowed silently and went out. There were two different reception rooms in Dr. Silence's house. One, intended for persons who imagined they needed spiritual assistance when really they were only candidates for the asylum, had padded walls, and was well supplied with various concealed contrivances by means of which sudden violence could be instantly met and overcome. It was, however, rarely used. The other, intended for the reception of genuine cases of spiritual distress and out-of-the-way afflictions of a psychic nature, was entirely draped and furnished in a soothing deep green, calculated to induce calmness and repose of mind. And this room was the one in which Dr. Silence interviewed the majority of his queer cases, and the one into which he had directed Barker to show his present caller. To begin with, the armchair in which the patient was always directed to sit was nailed to the floor, since its immovability tended to impart this same excellent characteristic to the occupant. Patients invariably grew excited when talking about themselves, and their excitement tended to confuse their thoughts and to exaggerate their language. The inflexibility of the chair helped to counteract this. After repeated endeavours to drag it forward or push it back, they ended by resigning themselves to sitting quietly, and with the futility of fidgeting there followed a calmer state of mind. Upon the floor and at intervals in the wall immediately behind were certain tiny green buttons, practically unnoticeable, which, on being pressed, permitted a soothing and persuasive narcotic to rise invisibly about the occupant of the chair. The effect upon the excitable patient was rapid, admirable, and harmless. The green study was further provided with a secret spy-hole, for John Silence liked, when possible, to observe his patient's face before it had assumed that mask the features of the human countenance invariably wear in the presence of another person. A man sitting alone wears a psychic expression, and this expression is the man himself. It disappears the moment another person joins him, and Dr. Silence often learned more from a few moments' secret observation of a face than from hours of conversation with its owner afterwards. A very light, almost a dancing step, followed Barker's heavy tread towards the green room, and a moment afterwards the man came in and announced that the gentleman was waiting. He was still pale, and his manner nervous. "Never mind, Barker," the doctor said kindly. "If you were not psychic, the man would have had no effect upon you at all. You only need training and development, and when you have learned to interpret these feelings and sensations better, you will feel no fear, but only a great sympathy." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." And Barker bowed and made his escape, while Dr. Silence, an amused smile lurking about the corners of his mouth, made his way noiselessly down the passage and put his eye to the spy-hole in the door of the green study. This spy-hole was so placed that it commanded a view of almost the entire room, and looking through it, the doctor saw a hat, gloves, and umbrella lying on a chair by the table, but searched at first in vain for their owner. The windows were both closed, and a brisk fire burned in the grate. There were various signs intelligible at least to a keenly intuitive soul, that the room was occupied, yet so far as human beings were concerned, it was empty, utterly empty. No one sat in the chairs. No one stood on the mat before the fire. There was no sign even that a patient was anywhere close against the wall, examining the Berkelen reproductions, as patients so often did when they thought they were alone, and therefore rather difficult to see from the spy-hole. Ordinarily speaking, there was no one in the room. It was undeniable. Yet Dr. Silence was quite well aware that a human being was in the room. His psychic apparatus never failed in letting him know the proximity of an incarnate or discarnate being. Even in the dark he could tell that. And he now knew positively that his patient, the patient who had alarmed Barker and had then tripped down the corridor with that dancing footstep, was somewhere concealed within the four walls commanded by his spy-hole. He also realized, and this was most unusual, that this individual whom he desired to watch knew that he was being watched, and further that the stranger himself was also watching. In fact, that it was he, the doctor, who was being observed, and by an observer as keen and trained as himself. An inkling of the true state of the case began to dawn upon him, and he was on the verge of entering, indeed his hand already touched the door-knob, when his eye, still glued to the spy-hole, detected a slight movement. Directly opposite, between him and the fireplace, something stirred. He watched very attentively, and made certain that he was not mistaken. An object on the mantelpiece, it was a blue vase, disappeared from view. It passed out of sight together with a portion of the marble mantelpiece on which it rested. Next, that part of the fire and grate and brass fender immediately below it vanished entirely, as though a slice had been taken clean out of them. Dr. Silence then understood that something between him and these objects was slowly coming into being, something that concealed them and obstructed his vision, by inserting itself in the line of sight between them and himself. He quietly awaited further results before going in. First he saw a thin perpendicular line tracing itself from just above the height of the clock and continuing downward till it reached the woolly fire-mat. This line grew wider, broadened, grew solid. It was no shadow. It was something substantial. It defined itself more and more. Then suddenly, at the top of the line, and about on a level with the face of the clock, he saw a round, luminous disk gazing steadily at him. It was a human eye, looking straight into his own, pressed there against the spy-hole, and it was bright with intelligence. Dr. Silence held his breath for a moment, and then stared back at it. Then, like some one moving out of deep shadow into light, he saw the figure of a man come sliding sideways into view, a whitish face following the eye, and the perpendicular line he had first observed broadening out and developing into the complete figure of a human being. It was the patient. He had apparently been standing there in front of the fire all the time. A second eye had followed the first, and both of them stared steadily at the spy-hole, sharply concentrated, yet with a sly twinkle of humour and amusement that made it impossible for the doctor to maintain his position any longer. He opened the door and went in quickly. As he did so, he noticed for the first time the sound of a German band coming in gaily through the open ventilators. In some intuitive, unaccountable fashion, the music connected itself with the patient he was about to interview. This sort of prevision was not unfamiliar to him. It always explained itself later. The man he saw was of middle age and of very ordinary appearance, so ordinary, in fact, that he was difficult to describe, his only peculiarity being his extreme thinness. Pleasant, that is, good, vibrations issued from his atmosphere, and met Dr. Silence as he advanced to greet him, yet vibrations alive with currents and discharges betraying the perturbed and disordered condition of his mind and brain. There was evidently something wholly out of the usual in the state of his thoughts. Yet, though strange, it was not altogether distressing. It was not the impression that the broken and violent atmosphere of the insane produces upon the mind. Dr. Silence realized in a flash that here was a case of absorbing interest that might require all his powers to handle properly. "I was watching you through my little peep-hole, as you saw," he began with a pleasant smile, advancing to shake hands. "I find it of the greatest assistance sometimes—" But the patient interrupted him at once. His voice was hurried, and had odd, shrill changes in it, breaking from high to low in unexpected fashion. One moment it thundered, the next it almost squeaked. "I understand without explanation," he broke in rapidly. "You get the true note of a man in this way, when he thinks himself unobserved. I quite agree. Only in my case I fear you saw very little. My case, as you of course grasp, Dr. Silence, is extremely peculiar, uncomfortably peculiar. Indeed, unless Sir William had positively assured me—" "My friend has sent you to me," the doctor interrupted gravely, with a gentle note of authority, "and that is quite sufficient. Pray be seated, Mr. Mudge. Racine Mudge," returned the other. "Take this comfortable one, Mr. Mudge," leading him to the fixed chair, "and tell me your condition in your own way and at your own pace. My whole day is at your service if you require it." Mr. Mudge moved towards the chair in question, and then hesitated. "You will promise me not to use the narcotic buttons," he said, before sitting down. "I do not need them. Also, I ought to mention that anything you think of vividly will reach my mind. That is apparently part of my peculiar case." He sat down with a sigh, and arranged his thin legs and body into a position of comfort. Evidently he was very sensitive to the thoughts of others, for the picture of the green buttons had only entered the doctor's mind for a second, yet the other had instantly snapped it up. Dr. Silence noticed, too, that Mr. Mudge held on tightly with both hands to the arms of the chair. "I'm rather glad the chair is nailed to the floor," he remarked, as he settled himself more comfortably. "It suits me admirably. The fact is, and this is my case in a nutshell, which is all that a doctor of your marvellous development requires, the fact is, Dr. Silence, I am a victim of higher space. That's what's the matter with me. Higher space." The two looked at each other for a space in silence, the little patient holding tightly to the arms of the chair, which suited him admirably, and looking up with staring eyes, his atmosphere positively trembling with the waves of some unknown activity, while the doctor smiled kindly and sympathetically, and put his whole person, as far as possible, into the mental condition of the other. "Higher space," repeated Mr. Mudge. "That's what it is. Now, do you think you can help me with that?" There was a pause, during which the men's eyes steadily searched down below the surface of their respective personalities. Then Dr. Silence spoke. "I am quite sure I can help," he answered quietly. "Sympathy must always help, and suffering always owns my sympathy. I see you have suffered cruelly. You must tell me all about your case, and when I hear the gradual steps by which you reached this strange condition, I have no doubt I can be of assistance to you." He drew a chair up beside his interlocutor, and laid a hand on his shoulder for a moment. His whole being radiated kindness, intelligence, desire to help. "For instance," he went on, "I feel sure it was the result of no mere chance that you became familiar with the terrors of what you term higher space. For higher space is no mere external measurement. It is, of course, a spiritual state, a spiritual condition, an inner development, and one that we must recognize as abnormal, since it is beyond the reach of the world at the present stage of evolution. Higher space is a mythical state." "Oh," cried the other, rubbing his bird-like hands with pleasure, "the relief it is to talk to some one who can understand. Of course, what you say is the utter truth, and you are right that no mere chance led me to my present condition, but, on the other hand, prolonged and deliberate study. Yet chance, in a sense, now governs it. I mean, my entering the condition of higher space seems to depend upon the chance of this and that circumstance. For instance, the mere sound of that German band sent me off. Not that all music will do so, but certain sounds, certain vibrations, at once key me up to the requisite pitch, and off I go. Wagner's music always does it, and that band must have been playing a stray bit of Wagner. But I'll come to all that later. Only first I must ask you to send away your man from the spy-hole." John Silence looked up with a start, for Mr. Mudge's back was to the door, and there was no mirror. He saw the brown eye of Barker glued to the little circle of glass, and he crossed the room without a word and snapped down the black shutter provided for the purpose, and then heard Barker shuffle away along the passage. "Now," continued the little man in the chair, "I can begin. You have managed to put me completely at my ease, and I feel I may tell you my whole case without shame or reserve. You will understand. But you must be patient with me if I go into details that are already familiar to you, details of higher space, I mean, and if I seem stupid when I have to describe things that transcend the power of language and are really, therefore, indescribable." "My dear friend," put in the other calmly, "that goes without saying. To know higher space is an experience that defies description, and one is obliged to make use of more or less intelligible symbols. But pray proceed. Your vivid thoughts will tell me more than your halting words." An immense sigh of relief proceeded from the little figure, half lost in the depths of the chair. Such intelligent sympathy, meeting him half-way, was a new experience to him, and it touched his heart at once. He leaned back, relaxing his tight hold of the arms, and began in his thin, scale-like voice. "My mother was a Frenchwoman, and my father an Essex bargeman," he said abruptly. "Hence my name, Racine and Mudge. My father died before I ever saw him. My mother inherited money from her Bordeaux relations, and when she died soon after, I was left alone with wealth and a strange freedom. I had no guardian, trustees, sisters, brothers, or any connection in the world to look after me. I grew up, therefore, utterly without education. This much was to my advantage. I learned none of that deceitful rubbish taught in schools, and so had nothing to unlearn when I awakened to my true love, mathematics, higher mathematics, and higher geometry. These, however, I seemed to know instinctively. It was like the memory of what I had deeply studied before. The principles were in my blood, and I simply raced through the ordinary stages and beyond, and then did the same with geometry. Afterwards, when I read the books on these subjects, I understood how swift and undeviating the knowledge had come back to me. It was simply recollecting the memories of what I had known before in a previous existence, and required no books to teach me. In his growing excitement, Mr. Mudge attempted to drag the chair forward a little nearer to his listener, and then smiled faintly as he resigned himself instantly again to its immovability, and plunged anew into the recital of his singular disease. The audacious speculations of Boyer, the amazing theories of Gauss, that through a point more than one line could be drawn parallel to a given line, the possibility that the angles of a triangle are together greater than two right angles, if drawn upon immense curvatures, the breathless intuitions of Bertrami and Lubitschowski, all these I hurried through, and emerged, panting but unsatisfied, upon the verge of my new world, my higher space possibilities, in a word, my disease. How I got there, he resumed, after a brief pause, during which he appeared to be listening intently for an approaching sound, is more than I can put intelligibly into words. I can only hope to leave your mind with an intuitive comprehension of the possibility of what I say. Here, however, came a change. At this point I was no longer absorbing the fruits of studies I had made before. It was the beginning of new efforts to learn for the first time, and I had to go slowly and laboriously through terrible work. Here I sought for the theories and speculations of others, but books were few and far between, and with the exception of one man, a dreamer, the world called him, whose audacity and piercing intuition amazed and delighted me beyond description, I found no one to guide or help. You, of course, Dr. Silence, understand something of what I am driving at with these stammering words, though you cannot perhaps yet guess what depths of pain my new knowledge brought me to, nor why an acquaintance with a new development of space should prove a source of misery and terror. Mr. Racine Mudge, remembering that the chair would not move, did the next best thing he could in his desire to draw nearer to the attentive man facing him, and sat forward upon the very edge of the cushions, crossing his legs and gesticulating with both hands as though he saw into the region of new space he was attempting to describe, and might any moment tumble into it bodily from the edge of the chair and disappear from view. John Silence, separated from him by 3 paces, sat with his eyes fixed upon the thin white face opposite, noting every word and every gesture with deep attention. This room we now sit in, Dr. Silence, has one side open to space, to higher space. A closed box only seems closed. There is a way in and out of a soap bubble without breaking the skin. You tell me no new thing, the doctor interposed gently. Hence, if higher space exists, and our world borders upon it and lies partially in it, it follows necessarily that we see only portions of all objects. We never see their true and complete shape. We see their 3 measurements, but not their 4th. The new direction is concealed from us, and when I hold this book and move my hand all around it, I have not really made a complete circuit. We only perceive those portions of any object which exist in our 3 dimensions. The rest escapes us. But once we learn to see in higher space, and objects will appear as they actually are. Only they will thus be hardly recognizable. Now you may begin to grasp something of what I am coming to. I am beginning to understand something of what you must have suffered, observed the doctor soothingly, for I have made similar experiments myself, and only stopped just in time. You are the one man in all the world who can hear and understand and sympathize, exclaimed Mr. Mudge, grasping his hand and holding it tightly while he spoke. The nailed chair prevented further excitability. Well, he resumed after a moment's pause, I procured the implements and the colored blocks for practical experiment, and I followed the instructions carefully till I had arrived at a working conception of 4-dimensional space. The tesseract, the figure whose boundaries are cubes, I knew by heart. That is to say, I knew it and saw it mentally, for my eye, of course, could never take in a new measurement, or my hands and feet handle it. So, at least, I thought, he added, making a wry face, I had reached the stage, you see, when I could imagine in a new dimension. I was able to conceive the shape of that new figure which is intrinsically different to all we know, the shape of the tesseract. I could perceive in 4 dimensions. When, therefore, I looked at a cube, I could see all its sides at once. Its top was not foreshortened, nor its farther side and base invisible. I saw the whole thing out flat, so to speak, and this tesseract was bounded by cubes. Moreover, I also saw its content, its insides. You were not yourself able to enter this new world, interrupted Dr. Silence. Not then. I was only able to conceive intuitively what it was like, and how exactly it must look. Later, when I slipped in there, and saw objects in their entirety, unlimited by the paucity of our poor 3 measurements, I very nearly lost my life. For you see, space does not stop at a single new dimension of 4th. It extends in all possible new ones, and we must conceive it as containing any number of new dimensions. In other words, there is no space at all, but only a spiritual condition. But meanwhile I had come to grasp the strange fact that the objects in our normal world appear to us only partially. Mr. Mudge moved farther forward till he was balanced dangerously on the very edge of the chair. From this starting point," he resumed, "I began my studies and experiments, and continued them for years. I had money, and I was without friends. I lived in solitude and experimented. My intellect, of course, had little part in the work, for intellectually it was all unthinkable. Never was the limitation of mere reason more plainly demonstrated. It was mystically, intuitively, spiritually that I began to advance, and what I learnt, and knew, and did, is all impossible to put into language, since it all describes experiences transcending the experience of men. It is only some of the results, what you would call the symptoms of my disease, that I can give you, and even these must often appear absurd contradictions and impossible paradoxes. I can only tell you, Dr. Silence," his manner became exceedingly impressive, "that I reached sometimes a point of view whence all the great puzzle of the world became plain to me, and I understood what they call in the Yoga books the great heresy of separateness. Why all great teachers have urged the necessity of man loving his neighbor as himself, how men are all really one, and why the utter loss of self is necessary to salvation and the discovery of the new life of the soul." He paused a moment and drew breath. "Your speculations have been my own long ago," the doctor said quietly. "I fully realize the force of your words. Men are doubtless not separate at all, in the sense they imagine. All this about the very much higher space I only dimly, very dimly conceived, of course," the other went on, raising his voice again by jerks. "But what did happen to me was the humbler accident of the simpler disaster. Oh, dear, how shall I put it?" He stammered and showed visible signs of distress. "It was simply this," he resumed, with a sudden rush of words, "that accidentally, as the result of my years of experiment, I one day slipped bodily into the next world, the world of 4 dimensions, yet without knowing precisely how I got there, or how I could get back again. I discovered, that is, that my ordinary 3-dimensional body was but an expression, a projection, of my higher 4-dimensional body. Now you understand what I meant much earlier in our talk, when I spoke of chance. I cannot control my entrance or exit. Certain people, certain human atmospheres, certain wandering forces, thoughts, desires even, the radiations of certain combinations of colour, and above all the vibrations of certain kinds of music, will suddenly throw me into a state of what I can only describe as an intense and terrific inner vibration, and behold, I am off in the direction at right angles to all our known directions, off in the direction the cube takes when it begins to trace the outlines of a new figure, off into my breathless and semi-divine higher space, off inside myself into the world of 4 dimensions. He gasped and dropped back into the depths of the immovable chair. "And there," he whispered, his voice issuing from among the cushions, "there I have to stay until these vibrations subside, or until they do something which I cannot find words to describe properly or intelligibly to you, and then, behold, I am back again. First, that is, I disappear, then I reappear." "Just so," exclaimed Dr. Silence, "and that is why a few—" "Why, a few moments ago," interrupted Mr. Mudge, taking the words out of his mouth, "you found me gone, and then saw me return. The music of that wretched German band sent me off. Your intense thinking about me brought me back, when the band had stopped its Wagner. I saw you approach the peephole, and I saw Barker's intention of doing so later. For me, no interiors are hidden. I see inside. When in that state, the content of your mind as of your body is open to me as the day. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear!" Mr. Mudge stopped and again mopped his brow. A light trembling ran over the surface of his small body like wind over grass. He still held tightly to the arms of the chair. "At first," he presently resumed, "my new experiences were so vividly interesting that I felt no alarm. There was no room for it. The alarm came a little later." "Then you actually penetrated far enough into that state to experience yourself as a normal portion of it?" asked the doctor, leaning forward, deeply interested. Mr. Mudge nodded a perspiring face in reply. "I did," he whispered. "Undoubtedly I did. I am coming to all that. It began first at night when I realized that sleep brought no loss of consciousness." "The spirit, of course, can never sleep. Only the body becomes unconscious," interposed John Silence. "Yes, we know that, theoretically. At night, of course, the spirit is active elsewhere, and we have no memory of where and how, simply because the brain stays behind and receives no record. But I found that, while remaining conscious, I also retained memory. I had attained to the state of continuous consciousness, for at night I regularly, with the first approaches of drowsiness, entered nolens volens, the four-dimensional world. For a time this happened regularly, and I could not control it, though later I found a way to regulate it better. Apparently sleep is unnecessary in the higher, the four-dimensional body. Yes, perhaps. But I should infinitely have preferred dull sleep to the knowledge. For, unable to control my movements, I wandered to and fro, attracted, owing to my partial development and premature arrival, to parts of this new world that alarmed me more and more. It was the awful waste and drift of a monstrous world, so utterly different to all we know and see, that I cannot even hint at the nature of the sights and objects and beings in it. More than that, I cannot even remember them. I cannot now picture them to myself even, but can recall only the memory of the impression they made upon me, the horror and devastating terror of it all. To be in several places at once, for instance." "Perfectly," interrupted John Silence, noticing the increase of the other's excitement. "I understand exactly. But now, please, tell me a little more of this alarm you experienced, and how it affected you." "It's not the disappearing and reappearing per se that I mind," continued Mr. Mudge, "so much as certain other things. It's seeing people and objects in their weird entirety, in their true and complete shapes, that is so distressing. It introduces me to a world of monsters. Horses, dogs, cats, all of which I loved. People, trees, children, all that I have considered beautiful in life, everything from a human face to a cathedral, appear to me in a different shape and aspect to all I have known before. I cannot perhaps convince you why this should be terrible, but I assure you that it is so. To hear the human voice proceeding from this novel appearance, which I scarcely recognize as a human body, is ghastly, simply ghastly. To see inside everything and everybody is a form of insight peculiarly distressing. To be so confused in geography as to find myself one moment at the North Pole and the next at Clapham Junction, or possibly at both places simultaneously, is absurdly terrifying. Your imagination will readily furnish other details without my multiplying my experiences now. But you have no idea what it all means, and how I suffer." Mr. Mudge paused in his panting account, and lay back in his chair. He still held tightly to the arms, as though they could keep him in the world of sanity and three measurements, and only now and again released his left hand in order to mop his face. He looked very thin and white, and oddly unsubstantial, and he stared about him as though he saw into this other space he had been talking about. John Silence, too, felt warm. He had listened to every word and had made many notes. The presence of this man had an exhilarating effect upon him. It seemed as if Mr. Racine Mudge still carried with him something of that breathless higher space condition he had been describing. At any rate, Dr. Silence had himself advanced sufficiently far along the legitimate paths of spiritual and psychic transformations to realize that the visions of this extraordinary little person had a basis of truth for their origin. After a pause that prolonged itself into minutes, he crossed the room and unlocked a drawer in a bookcase, taking out a small book with a red cover. It had a lock to it, and he produced a key out of his pocket and proceeded to open the covers. The bright eyes of Mr. Mudge never left him for a single second. "It almost seems a pity," he said at length, "to cure you, Mr. Mudge. You are on the way to discovery of great things. Though you may lose your life in the process, that is, your life here in the world of 3 dimensions, you would lose thereby nothing of great value. You will pardon my apparent rudeness, I know, and you might gain what is infinitely greater. Your suffering, of course, lies in the fact that you alternate between the 2 worlds, and are never wholly in one or the other. Also, I rather imagine, though I cannot be certain of this from any personal experiments, that you have here and there penetrated even into space of more than 4 dimensions, and have hence experienced the terror you speak of." The perspiring son of the Essex bargeman and the woman of Normandy bent his head several times in assent, but uttered no word in reply. "Some strange psychic predisposition, dating no doubt from one of your former lives, has favored the development of your disease, and the fact that you had no normal training at school or college, no leading by the poor intellect into the cul-de-sac falsely called knowledge, has further caused your exceedingly rapid movement along the lines of direct inner experience. None of the knowledge you have foreshadowed has come to you through the senses, of course." Mr. Mudge, sitting in his immovable chair, began to tremble slightly. A wind again seemed to pass over his surface, and again to set it curiously in motion like a field of grass. "You are merely talking to gain time," he said hurriedly in a shaking voice. "This thinking aloud delays us. I see ahead what you are coming to, only please be quick, for something is going to happen. A band is again coming down the street, and if it plays Wagner, I shall be off in a twinkling." "Precisely. I will be quick. I was leading up to the point of how to effect your cure. The way is this. You must simply learn to block the entrances." "True, true, utterly true!" exclaimed the little man, dodging about nervously in the depths of the chair. "But how, in the name of space, is that to be done?" "By concentration. They are all within you, these entrances, although outer cases such as music, color, and other things lead you towards them. These external things you cannot hope to destroy, but once the entrances are blocked, they will lead you only to bricked walls and closed channels. You will no longer be able to find the way." "Quick, quick!" cried the bobbing figure in the chair. "How is this concentration to be effected?" "This little book," continued Dr. Silence calmly, "will explain to you the way." He tapped the cover. "Let me now read out to you certain simple instructions, composed, as I see you divine, entirely from my own personal experiences in the same direction. Follow these instructions, and you will no longer enter the state of higher space. The entrance will be blocked effectively." Mr. Mudge sat bolt upright in his chair to listen, and John Silence cleared his throat and began to read slowly in a very distinct voice. But before he had uttered a dozen words, something happened. A sound of street music entered the room through the open ventilators, for a band had begun to play in the stable mews at the back of the house, the march from Tannhäuser. Odd as it may seem that a German band should twice within the space of an hour enter the same mews and play Wagner, it was nevertheless the fact. Mr. Racine Mudge heard it. He uttered a sharp, squeaking cry, and twisted his arms with nervous energy round the chair. A piteous look that was not far from tears spread over his white face. Grey shadows followed it, the grey of fear. He began to struggle convulsively. "Hold me fast! Catch me! For God's sake, keep me here! I'm on the rush already. Oh, it's frightful!" he cried in tones of anguish, his voice as thin as a reed. Dr. Silence made a plunge forward to seize him, but in a flash, before he could cover the space between them, Mr. Racine Mudge, screaming and struggling, seemed to shoot past him into invisibility. He disappeared like an arrow from a bow propelled at infinite speed, and his voice no longer sounded in the external air, but seemed in some curious way to make itself heard somewhere within the depths of the doctor's own being. It was almost like a faint singing cry in his head, like a voice of a dream, a voice of vision and unreality. "Alcohol! Alcohol!" it cried. "Give me alcohol! It's the quickest way! Alcohol before I'm out of reach!" The doctor, accustomed to rapid decisions and even more rapid action, remembered that a brandy flask stood upon the mantelpiece, and in less than a second he had seized it and was holding it out towards the space above the chair recently occupied by the visible Mudge. Then, before his very eyes, and long ere he could unscrew the metal stopper, he saw the contents of the closed glass vial sink and lessen, as though someone were drinking violently and greedily of the liquor within. "Thanks, enough! It deadens the vibrations," cried the faint voice in his interior, as he withdrew the flask and set it back upon the mantelpiece. He understood that in Mudge's present condition one side of the flask was open to space, and he could drink without removing the stopper. He could hardly have had a more interesting proof of what he had been hearing described at such length. But the next moment, the very same moment it almost seemed, the German band stopped midway in its tune, and there was Mr. Mudge, back in his chair again, gasping and panting. "Quick!" he shrieked. "Stop that band! Send it away! Catch hold of me! Block the entrances! Block the entrances! Give me the red book! Oh!" The music had begun again. It was merely a temporary interruption. The Tannhäuser March started again, this time at a tremendous pace that made it sound like a rapid two-step, as though the instruments played against time. But the brief interruption gave Dr. Silence a moment in which to collect his scattering thoughts, and before the band had gone through a half a bar, he had flung forward upon the chair and held Mr. Racine Mudge, the struggling little victim of higher space, in a grip of iron. His arms went all round his diminutive person, taking in a good part of the chair at the same time. He was not a big man, yet he seemed to smother Mudge completely. Yet even as he did so, and felt the wriggling form underneath him, it began to melt and slip away like air or water. The wood of the arm-chair somehow disentangled itself from between his own arms and those of Mudge. The phenomenon known as the passage of matter through matter took place. The little man seemed actually to get mixed up in his own being. Dr. Silence could just see his face beneath him. It puckered and grew dark as though from some great internal effort. He heard the thin, reedy voice cry in his ear to "Block the entrances! Block the entrances!" And then but how in the world to describe what is indescribable? John Silence half rose up to watch. Racine Mudge, his face distorted beyond all recognition, was making a marvellous inward movement, as though doubling back upon himself. He turned funnel-wise like water in a swirling vortex, and then appeared to break up somewhat as a reflection breaks up and divides in a distorting convex mirror. He went neither forward nor backward, neither to the right nor to the left, neither up nor down. But he went. He went utterly. He simply flashed away out of sight like a vanishing projectile. All but one leg. Dr. Silence just had the time and the presence of mind to seize upon the left ankle and boot as it disappeared, and to this he held on for several seconds, like grim death. Yet all the time he knew it was a foolish and useless thing to do. The foot was in his grasp one moment, and the next it seemed, this was the only way he could describe it, inside his own skin and bones, and at the same time outside his hand and all round it. It seemed mixed up in some amazing way with his own flesh and blood. Then it was gone, and he was tightly grasping a draught of heated air. "Gone! Gone! Gone!" cried a thick, whispering voice somewhere deep within his own consciousness. "Lost! Lost! Lost!" It repeated, growing fainter and fainter, till at length it vanished into nothing, and the last signs of Mr. Racine Mudge vanished with it. John Silence locked his red book and replaced it in the cabinet, which he fastened with a click, and when Barker answered the bell he inquired if Mr. Mudge had left a card upon the table. It appeared that he had, and when the servant returned with it, Dr. Silence read the address and made a note of it. It was in North London. "Mr. Mudge has gone," he said quietly to Barker, noticing his expression of alarm. "He's not taken his hat with him, sir." "Mr. Mudge requires no hat where he is now," continued the doctor, stooping to poke the fire, "but he may return for it." "And the umbrella, sir?" "And the umbrella." "He didn't go out my way, sir, if you please," stuttered the amazed servant, his curiosity overcoming his nervousness. "Mr. Mudge has his own way of coming and going, and prefers it. If he returns by the door at any time, remember to bring him instantly to me, and be kind and gentle with him, and ask no questions. Also remember, Barker, to think pleasantly, sympathetically, affectionately of him while he is away. Mr. Mudge is a very suffering gentleman." Barker bowed and went out of the room backwards, gasping and feeling round the inside of his collar with 3 very hot fingers of one hand. It was 2 days later when he brought in a telegram to the study. Dr. Silence opened it and read as follows: "Bombay. Just slipped out again. All safe. Have blocked entrances. 1,000 thanks. Address Cook's, London. Mudge." Dr. Silence looked up and saw Barker staring at him bewilderingly. It occurred to him that somehow he knew the contents of the telegram. "Make a parcel of Mr. Mudge's things," he said briefly, "and address them Thomas Cook & Sons, Ludgate Circus, and send them there exactly a month from to-day, and marked, 'To be called for.'" "Yes, sir," said Barker, leaving the room with a deep sigh and a hurried glance at the waste-paper basket where his master had dropped the pink paper. End of Story 13. Story 14 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 14, Transition. John Mudbury was on his way home from the shops, his arms full of Christmas presents. It was after 6 o'clock, and the streets were very crowded. He was an ordinary man, lived in an ordinary suburban flat, with an ordinary wife and 4 ordinary children. He did not think them ordinary, but everybody else did. He had ordinary presents for each one, a cheap blotter for his wife, a cheap air gun for the eldest boy, and so forth. He was over 50, bald, in an office, decent in mind and habits, of uncertain opinions, uncertain politics, and uncertain religion. Yet he considered himself a decided, positive gentleman, quite unaware that the morning newspaper determined his opinions for the day. He just lived from day to day. Physically he was fit enough, except for a weak heart, which never troubled him, and his summer holiday was bad golf, while the children bathed and his wife read Garvice on the sands. Like the majority of men, he dreamed idly of the past, muddled away the present, and guessed vaguely, after imaginative reading on occasions, at the future. "I'd like to survive all right," he said, "provided it's better than this," surveying his wife and children, and thinking of his daily toil. "Otherwise—" and he shrugged his shoulders as a brave man should. He went to church regularly, but nothing in church convinced him that he did survive, just as nothing in church enticed him into hoping that he would. On the other hand, nothing in life persuaded him that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. "I'm an evolutionist," he loved to say to thoughtful cronies over a glass, having never heard that Darwinism had been questioned. And so he came home gaily, happily, with his bunch of Christmas presents for the wife and little ones, stroking himself upon their keen enjoyment and excitement. The night before he had taken the wife to see Magic at a select London theatre where the intellectuals went, and had been extraordinarily stirred. He had gone questioningly, yet expecting something out of the common. "It's not musical," he warned her, "nor farce, nor comedy, so to speak," and in answer to her questions as to what the critics had said, he had wriggled, sighed, and put his gaudy necktie straight 4 times in quick succession, for no man in the street with any claim to self-respect could be expected to understand what the critics had said, even if he understood the play. And John had answered truthfully, "Oh, they just said things, but the theatre's always full, and that's the only test." And just now, as he crossed the crowded Circus to catch his bus, it chanced that his mind, having glimpsed an advertisement, was full of this particular play, or rather of the effect it had produced upon him at the time. For it had thrilled him, inexplicably. With its marvellous speculative hint, its big audacity, its alert and spiritual beauty, thought plunged to find something, plunged after this bizarre suggestion of a bigger universe, after this quasi-jocular suggestion that man is not the only, then dashed full tilt against a sentence that memory thrust beneath his nose: "Science does not exhaust the universe," and at the same time dashed full tilt against destruction of another kind as well. How it happened he never exactly knew. He saw a monster glaring at him with eyes of blazing fire. It was horrible. It rushed upon him. He dodged. Another monster met him round the corner. Both came at him simultaneously. He dodged again, a leap that might have cleared a hurdle easily, but was too late. Between the pair of them, his heart literally in his gullet, he was mercilessly caught. Bones crunched. There was a soft sensation, icy cold and hot as fire. Horns and voices roared, battering rams he saw, and a carapace of iron. Then dazzling light. "Always face the traffic," he remembered with a frantic yell, and by some extraordinary luck escaped miraculously on to the opposite pavement. There was no doubt about it. By the skin of his teeth he had dodged a rather ugly death. First, he felt for his presents, all were safe, and then, instead of congratulating himself and taking breath, he hurried homewards, on foot, which proved that his mind had lost control of it, thinking only how disappointed the wife and children would have been if anything had happened. Another thing he realized, oddly enough, was that he no longer really loved his wife, but only had great affection for her. What made him think of that, heaven only knows, but he did think of it. He was an honest man, without pretence. This came as a discovery somehow. He turned a moment and saw the crowd gathered about the entangled taxicabs, policemen's helmets gleaming in the lights of the shop windows, then hurried on again, his thoughts full of the joy his presence would give, of the scampering children, and his wife, bless her silly heart, eyeing the mysterious parcels. And though he never could explain how, he presently stood at the door of the jail-like building that contained his flat, having walked the whole 3 miles. His thoughts had been so busy and absorbed that he had scarcely noticed the length of weary trudge. Besides, he reflected, thinking of the narrow escape, "I've had a nasty shock. It was a damned near thing, now I come to think of it." He did feel a bit shaky and bewildered. Yet, at the same time, he felt extraordinarily jolly and light-hearted. He counted his Christmas parcels, hugged himself in anticipatory joy, and let himself in swiftly with his latchkey. "I'm late," he realized, "but when she sees the brown paper parcels, she'll forget to say a word. God bless the old faithful soul," and he softly used the key a second time and entered his flat on tiptoe. In his mind was the master impulse of that afternoon, the pleasure these Christmas presents would give his wife and children. He heard a noise. He hung up hat and coat in the poky vestibule (they never called it hall), and moved softly towards the parlour door, holding the packages behind him. Only of them, he thought, not of himself. Of his family, that is, not of the packages. Pushing the door cunningly ajar, he peeped in slyly. To his amazement, the room was full of people. He withdrew quickly, wondering what it meant. A party? And without his knowing about it? Extraordinary! Keen disappointment came over him. But as he stepped back, the vestibule, he saw, was full of people too. He was uncommonly surprised, yet somehow not surprised at all. People were congratulating him. There was a perfect mob of them. Moreover, he knew them all, vaguely remembered them at least, and they knew him. "Isn't it a game?" laughed someone, patting him on the back. "They haven't the least idea." And the speaker, it was old John Palmer, the bookkeeper at the office, emphasized the "they." "Not the least idea," he answered with a smile, saying something he didn't understand, yet knew was right. His face apparently showed the utter bewilderment he felt. The shock of the collision had been greater than he realized, evidently. His mind was wandering, possibly. Only the odd thing was, he had never felt so clear-headed in his life. 10,000 things grew simple suddenly. But how thickly these people pressed upon him, and how familiarly! "My parcels," he said, joyously pushing his way across the throng. "These are Christmas presents I've brought for them." He nodded toward the room. "I've saved for weeks, stopped cigars and billiards and several other good things to buy them." "Good man," said Palmer with a happy laugh. "It's the heart that counts." Mudbury looked at him. Palmer had said an amazing truth, only people would hardly understand and believe him, would they? "Eh?" he asked, feeling stuffed and stupid, muddled somewhere between two meanings, one of which was gorgeous and the other stupid beyond belief. "If you please, Mr. Mudbury, step inside. They are expecting you," said a kindly, pompous voice, and turning sharply he met the gentle, foolish eyes of Sir James Epiphany, a director of the bank where he worked. The effect of the voice was instantaneous, from long habit. "They are?" He smiled from his heart, and advanced as from the custom of many years. Oh, how happy and gay he felt! His affection for his wife was real. Romance indeed had gone, but he needed her, and she needed him. And the children, Milly, Bill, and Jean, he deeply loved them. Life was worth living indeed. In the room was a crowd, but an astounding silence. John Mudbury looked round him. He advanced towards his wife, who sat in the corner armchair with Milly on her knee. A lot of people talked and moved about. Momentarily the crowd increased. He stood in front of them, in front of Milly and his wife, and he spoke, holding out his packages. "It's Christmas Eve," he whispered shyly, "and I've brought you something for everybody. Look!" He held the packages before their eyes. Of course," said a voice behind him, "but you may hold them out like that for a century. They'll never see them." "Of course they won't. But I love to do the old sweet thing," replied John Mudbury, then wondered with a gasp of stark amazement why he said it. "I think," whispered Milly, staring round her. "Well, what do you think?" her mother asked sharply. "You're always thinking something queer." "I think," the child continued dreamily, "that Daddy's already here." She paused, then added with a child's impossible conviction, "I'm sure he is. I feel him." There was an extraordinary laugh. Sir James Epiphany laughed. The others, the whole crowd of them, also turned their heads and smiled. But the mother, thrusting the child away from her, rose up suddenly with a violent start. Her face had turned to chalk. She stretched her arms out into the air before her. She gasped and shivered. There was an awful anguish in her eyes. "Look," repeated John, "these are the presents that I brought." But his voice apparently was soundless, and with a spasm of icy pain he remembered that Palmer and Sir James, some years ago, had died. "It's magic!" he cried. "But I love you, Jenny, I love you, and
And I have always been true to you, as true as steel. We need each other. Oh, can't you see? We go on together, you and I, forever and ever." "Think," interrupted an exquisitely tender voice. "Don't shout. They can't hear you now." And turning, John Mudbury met the eyes of Everard Minturn, their president of the year before. Minturn had gone down with the Titanic. He dropped his parcels then. His heart gave an enormous leap of joy. He saw her face, the face of his wife, look through him. But the child gazed straight into his eyes. She saw him. The next thing he knew was that he heard something tinkling, far, far away. It sounded miles below him, inside him. He was sounding himself, all utterly bewildering, like a bell. It was a bell. Milly stooped down and picked the parcels up. Her face shone with happiness and laughter. But a man came in soon after, a man with a ridiculous, solemn face, a pencil and a notebook. He wore a dark blue helmet. Behind him came a string of other men. They carried something, he could not see exactly what it was, but when he pressed forward through the laughing throng to gaze upon it, he dimly made out 2 eyes, a nose, a chin, a deep red smear, and a pair of folded hands upon an overcoat. A woman's form fell down upon them then, and he heard soft sounds of children weeping strangely, and other sounds as of familiar voices laughing gaily. "They'll join us presently. It goes like a flash." And turning with great happiness in his heart, he saw that Sir James had said it holding Palmer by the arm, as with some natural yet unexpected love of sympathetic friendship. "Come on," said Palmer, smiling like a man who accepts a gift in universal fellowship. "Let's help 'em. They'll never understand. Still, we can always try." The entire throng moved up with laughter and amusement. It was a moment of hearty, genuine life at last. Delight and joy and peace were everywhere. Then John Mudbury realized the truth, that he was dead. End of Story 14. Story 15 of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 15, The Tradition. The noises outside the little flat at first were very disconcerting after living in the country. They made sleep difficult. At the cottage in Sussex, where the family had lived, night brought deep, comfortable silence, unless the wind was high, when the pine trees round the duck pond made a sound like surf, or if the gale was from the southwest, the orchard roared a bit unpleasantly. But in London it was very different. Sleep was easier in the daytime than at night, for after nightfall the rumble of the traffic became spasmodic instead of continuous. The motor horns startled like warnings of alarm. After comparative silence, the furious rushing of a taxicab touched the nerves. From dinner till 11 o'clock the streets subsided gradually. Then came the army from theatres, parties, and late dinners, hurrying home to bed. The motor horns during this hour were lively and incessant, like bugles of a regiment moving into battle. The parents rarely retired until this attack was over. If quick about it, sleep was possible then before the flying of the night birds. An uncertain squadron screamed half the street awake again. But these finally disposed of, a delightful hush settled down upon the neighbourhood, profounder far than any peace of the countryside. The deep rumble of the produce wagons coming in to the big London markets from the farms, generally about 3 a.m., held no disturbing quality. But sometimes in the stillness of very early morning, when streets were empty and pavements all deserted, there was a sound of another kind that was startling and unwelcome, for it was ominous. It came with a clattering violence that made nerves quiver and forced the heart to pause and listen. A strange resonance was in it, a volume of sound, moreover, that was hardly justified by its cause, for it was hoofs.
A horse swept hurrying up the deserted street, and was close upon the building in a moment. It was audible suddenly, no gradual approach from a distance, but as though it turned a corner from soft ground that muffled the hoofs on to the echoing hard paving that emphasized the dreadful clatter. Nor did it die away again when once the house was reached. It ceased as abruptly as it came. The hoofs did not go away. It was the mother who heard them first, and drew her husband's attention to their disagreeable quality. "It is the mail vans, dear," he answered. "They go at 4 a.m. to catch the early trains into the country." She looked up sharply, as though something in his tone surprised her. "But there's no sound of wheels," she said. And then, as he did not reply, she added gravely, "You have heard it too, John, I can tell." "I have," he said. "I have heard it twice." And they looked at one another searchingly, each trying to read the other's mind. She did not question him. He did not propose writing to complain in a newspaper. Both understood something that neither of them understood. "I heard it first," she then said softly, "the night before Jack got the fever. And as I listened, I heard him crying. But when I went in to see, he was asleep. The noise stopped just outside the building." There was a shadow in her eyes as she said this, and a hush crept in between her words. "I did not hear it go." She said this almost beneath her breath. He looked a moment at the ground. Then, coming towards her, he took her in his arms and kissed her. And she clung very tightly to him. "Sometimes," he said in a quiet voice, "a mounted policeman passes down the street, I think." "It is a horse," she answered. But whether it was a question or mere corroboration he did not ask, for at that moment the doctor arrived, and the question of little Jack's health became the paramount matter of immediate interest. The great man's verdict was uncommonly disquieting. All that night they sat up in the sick-room. It was strangely still, as though by one accord the traffic avoided the house where a little boy hung between life and death. The motor horns even had a muffled sound, and heavy drays and wagons used the wide streets. There were fewer taxicabs about, or else they flew by noiselessly. Yet no straw was down. The expense prohibited that. And towards morning, very early, the mother decided to watch alone. She had been a trained nurse before her marriage, accustomed when she was younger to long vigils. "You go down, dear, and get a little sleep," she urged in a whisper. "He's quiet now. At 5 o'clock I'll come for you to take my place." "You'll fetch me at once," he whispered, "if—" then hesitated as though breath failed him. A moment he stood there, staring from her face to the bed. "If you hear anything," he finished. She nodded, and he went downstairs to his study, not to his bedroom. He left the door ajar. He sat in darkness, listening. Mother, he knew, was listening too, beside the bed. His heart was very full, for he did not believe the boy could live till morning. The picture of the room was all the time before his eyes, the shaded lamp, the table with the medicines, the little wasted figure beneath the blankets, and Mother close beside it, listening. He sat alert, ready to fly upstairs at the smallest cry. But no sound broke the stillness. The entire neighbourhood was silent. All London slept. He heard the clock strike 3 in the dining-room at the end of the corridor. It was still enough for that. There was not even the heavy rumble of a single produce wagon, though usually they passed about this time on their way to Smithfield and Covent Garden markets. He waited, far too anxious to close his eyes. At 4 o'clock he would go up and relieve her vigil. 4, he knew, was the time when life sinks to its lowest ebb. Then, in the middle of his reflections, thought stopped dead, and it seemed his heart stopped too. Far away, but coming nearer with extraordinary rapidity, a sharp, clear sound broke out of the surrounding stillness, a horse's hoofs. At first it was so distant that it might have been almost on the high roads of the country, but the amazing speed with which it came closer, and the sudden increase of the beating sound, was such that by the time he turned his head it seemed to have entered the street outside. It was within 100 yards of the building. The next second it was before the very door, and something in him blenched. He knew a moment's complete paralysis. The abrupt cessation of the heavy clatter was strangest of all. It came like lightning, it struck, it paused, it did not go away again. Yet the sound of it was still beating in his ears as he dashed upstairs 3 steps at a time. It seemed in the house as well, on the stairs behind him, in the little passage-way, inside the very bedroom. It was an appalling sound. Yet he entered a room that was quiet, orderly, and calm. It was silent. Beside the bed his wife sat, holding Jack's hand and stroking it. She was soothing him. Her face was very peaceful. No sound but her gentle whisper was audible. He controlled himself by a tremendous effort, but his face betrayed his consternation and distress. "Hush," she said beneath her breath. "He's sleeping much more calmly now. The crisis, bless God, is over, I do believe. I dared not leave him." He saw in a moment that she was right, and an untenable relief passed over him. He sat down beside her, very cold, yet perspiring with heat. "You heard?" he asked after a pause. "Nothing," she replied quickly, "except his pitiful, wild words when the delirium was on him. It's past. It's lasted but a moment, or I'd have called you." He stared closely into her tired eyes. "And his words?" he asked in a whisper. Whereupon she told him quietly that the little chap had sat up with wide-opened eyes and talked excitedly about a great, great horse he heard, but that was not coming for him. He laughed and said he would not go with it because he was not ready yet. Some scrap of talk he had overheard from us, she added, when we discussed the traffic once. "But you heard nothing?" he repeated, almost impatiently. No, she had heard nothing. After all, then, he had dozed a moment in his chair. 4 weeks later, Jack, entirely convalescent, was playing a restricted game of hide-and-seek with his sister in the flat. It was really a forbidden joy, owing to noise and risk of breakages, but he had unusual privileges after his grave illness. It was dusk. The lamps in the street were being lit. "Quietly, remember, your mother's resting in her room," were the father's orders. She had just returned from a week by the sea, recuperating from the strain of nursing for so many nights. The traffic rolled and boomed along the streets below. "Jack, do come on and hide. It's your turn. I hid last." But the boy was standing spellbound by the window, staring hard at something on the pavement. Sybil called and tugged in vain. Tears threatened. Jack would not budge. He declared he saw something. "Oh, you're always seeing something. I wish you'd go and hide. It's only because you can't think of a good place, really." "Look!" he cried in a voice of wonder, and as he said it his father rose quickly from his chair before the fire. "Look!" the child repeated with delight and excitement. "It's a great big horse, and it's perfectly white all over." His sister joined him at the window. "Where? Where? Oh, I can't see it. Oh, do show me." Their father was standing close behind them now. "I heard it," he was whispering, but so low the children did not notice him. His face was the color of chalk. "Straight in front of our door, stupid. Can't you see it? Oh, I do wish it had come for me. It's such a beauty." And he clapped his hands with pleasure and excitement. "Quick, quick, it's going away again." But while the children stood half squabbling by the window, their father leaned over a sofa in the adjoining room, above a figure whose heart in sleep had quietly stopped its beating. The great white horse had come. But this time he had not only heard its wonderful arrival, he had also heard it go. It seemed he heard the awful hoofs beat down the sky, far, far away, and very swiftly, dying into silence, finally up among the stars. End of Story 15. End of Day and Night Stories by Algernon Blackwood.